At my 35th wedding anniversary, my husband asked me to give my seat to his pregnant mistress. The request didn't come as a shout or a drunken demand. It came as a whisper, soft as the silk of my champagne-colored gown, leaning into the curve of my ear while 300 of Savannah's most prominent citizens watched us from the velvet-cushioned chairs of the Gentry Hotel ballroom. "Camille, sweetheart," Elias murmured, his hand resting with practiced affection on my shoulder. To anyone watching from the back of the room, it looked like a husband sharing a private, romantic joke with his wife of 3 decades. "Saffron is feeling a bit faint. The heat in here is getting to her, and the baby is kicking. Would you mind letting her sit here at the head table for a moment, just until the toast is over?" I didn't move. I didn't blink. I looked straight ahead at the 5-tier cake, iced in buttercream and draped in edible gold leaf, topped with a vintage porcelain couple that had belonged to my grandmother. I felt the weight of my own stillness. It was a heavy, tectonic thing. "Elias," I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. "This is the head table. My name is on the place card. Your mother's lace runner is beneath this plate." "I know whose seat it is," he said, and for the first time in 35 years, I heard the mask of the Southern gentleman slip, revealing the cold, architectural precision of the man who had built half the skyline of this city on the back of my inheritance and my silence. "But she needs the chair, Camille. Don't make a scene. Not tonight. Think of the children." I looked toward the third table, where our adult children sat. My daughter, Tasha, a high-powered attorney who I had raised to be a lioness, was carefully inspecting her manicure, refusing to meet my eyes. My son, Jordan, who held a vice presidency at his father's firm, was busying himself with his wineglass, his face flushed a deep, guilty crimson. And then I saw the children. My grandchildren. 6-year-old Ava and 4-year-old Leo were standing by a woman in a sage green maternity dress. She wasn't hidden in the back. She wasn't tucked away in a corner. She was standing 3 feet from the head table, her hand resting on a belly that was clearly 6 months along. She was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful before the first strike of lightning, young, ethereal, and utterly unbothered. "Grandma Saffron, look!" Leo chirped, his voice carrying through a sudden lull in the string quartet's rendition of "At Last." He was holding up a sugared almond, his face bright with the easy, uncomplicated love of a child. "I found the blue ones!" The woman, Saffron, smiled and stroked Leo's hair with a familiarity that suggested this wasn't the first, second, or even the 10th time they had spent Sunday afternoons together. "Those are the best ones, Leo. Thank you, sugar." The word grandma hit me harder than the request for my seat. It was a physical blow, a rhythmic thud against my ribs that threatened to crack the sternum I had kept so straight for so long. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. It always amazes me to see how far these stories travel and how many people around the world connect with them. I also want to ask you, if you were sitting in that chair, surrounded by the life you built, and heard your own grandchildren call another woman by your title, what would be the first thing you said? I didn't say anything at first. I let the silence stretch. I let the guests at the neighboring tables begin to whisper. I let the heat of the room rise until I could smell the lilies beginning to wilt in their crystal vases. Elias's grip on my shoulder tightened. It wasn't a caress anymore. It was a command. "Camille, move. Now." I turned my head slowly to look at him. Elias Thorne St. Clair was a man of silver hair and custom-tailored suits, a pillar of the First African Baptist Church, a man whose word was law in the boardroom. For 35 years, I had been the grace to his power. I had been the one who smoothed over his rough edges, who edited his speeches, who managed the accounts he couldn't be bothered with, and who maintained the illusion of a perfect, unbreakable union while he stayed late at the office or took business trips to Atlanta. I looked at his lapel. He was wearing a small, handcrafted silver pin in the shape of a sparrow. It wasn't a gift from me. I had never seen it before. "You want me to stand?" I said, my voice low enough that only he could hear, yet carrying the sharp edge of a diamond cutting glass. "On our 35th anniversary? In front of the mayor? In front of your partners? In front of my sisters? You want me to relinquish the place I earned so that she can rest her burden?" "It's just a chair, Camille," he hissed. "Don't be dramatic." "It is never just a chair, Elias. It is a position." I looked past him to Saffron. She didn't look triumphant. She looked bored. She looked like a woman who had already been promised the house, the name, and the life, and was simply waiting for the current occupant to vacate the premises. She caught my gaze and didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted her shawl, revealing a gold monogrammed necklace. S.S.C. Saffron Street, Clare. She was already using the name. She wasn't just the mistress. She was the replacement, and the paperwork had clearly already been filed in the hearts of my family long before this evening began. I looked at Tasha again, my daughter, the one I had stayed up with through every fever, the one whose bar exam fees I had paid out of my secret savings when Elias said she needed to earn her own way. Tasha finally looked up. There was no sympathy in her eyes. There was only a cold, transactional impatience. "Mom, just let her sit down," Tasha called out from her table, loud enough for the surrounding guests to gasp. "She's pregnant! It's not that big of a deal! You've been sitting all night anyway." The room went cold. Not the cooling of an air conditioner, but the chilling realization that the foundation of the house was not just cracked. It had been hollowed out from the inside. My children weren't victims of their father's deception. They were co-conspirators. They had traded their mother's dignity for a younger, newer model of family peace. I looked at the silver sparrow on Elias's lapel. I looked at the SSC on the girl's neck. And then I looked at the small, leather-bound planner sitting next to my bread plate. Inside that planner was a folded piece of paper, a bank statement I had found 3 days ago, showing a wire transfer of $600,000 from our joint retirement account to an LLC registered in Saffron LeClair's name. Elias thought he was asking me to give up a seat at a dinner table. He didn't realize I had already spent the last 72 hours deciding which table I was going to build next, and whose names would never be invited to sit at it. I stood up. A collective breath was drawn across the ballroom. The silk of my gown hissed against the chair. I moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who was not retreating, but deploying. "You're right, Elias," I said, loud enough for the microphone on the lectern to catch my voice. The feedback hummed through the hall, silencing the last of the whispers. "Saffron should absolutely have this seat. After all, she's already carrying so much of what belongs to this family." Elias's face paled. He reached for my arm, but I stepped back, just out of his reach. I didn't look angry. I looked radiant. I looked like a woman who had just been handed a gift she hadn't expected. In fact, I continued, smiling at the room, since this is a night for celebrations and new beginnings, I think it's only fair that Saffron takes my place entirely for the rest of the evening. She's already being called Grandma by my grandchildren. It would be a shame to keep her standing. I turned to Saffron. I didn't spit. I didn't scream. I walked over to her, took her hand, which was cold and trembling slightly, and led her to the head table. I pulled the chair out for her. "Sit, dear," I whispered, leaning close so she could smell the expensive Chanel No. 5 I had worn as armor. "Take the weight off your feet. You have no idea how heavy this chair actually is. But don't worry. By tomorrow morning, you'll be the only one left to carry it." I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't look at Elias's stunned expression or Jordan's bowed head. I walked back to my place setting, picked up my champagne glass, and drained it. Then, I picked up my clutch and my planner. "Happy anniversary, Elias," I said clearly. "I hope the 36th is exactly what you deserve." I walked out of the ballroom. I didn't run. I didn't look back. The click of my heels on the marble floor of the lobby sounded like a countdown. I walked straight to the valet. "Your car, Mrs. St. Clair?" the young man asked, stepping forward. "No, Marcus," I said, handing him a $20 bill. "Call me a car. And tell Mr. St. Clair that the Bentley is parked in the river lot with the keys in the exhaust pipe. He'll find it eventually." I got into the black town car that arrived 5 minutes later. As we pulled away from the Gentry Hotel, I saw the silhouette of my son Jordan running out of the lobby, waving his arms, looking like a panicked child who had suddenly realized the safety net had been retracted. I didn't tell the driver to stop. I opened my planner, took out my phone, and dialed a number I had memorized 20 years ago but never had the heart to use. "He did it," I said when the voice on the other end answered. "Are you sure, Camille?" The voice, my sister, a woman who had spent 30 years telling me Elias was a hollow man, asked softly. "He asked me to give my seat to her, Sarah, in front of everyone. The children were in on it. They're calling her Grandma." There was a long silence on the other end. Then, Sarah spoke with a cold, sharp clarity. "Then the grace period is over. Do you have the files?" "I have everything," I said, looking out the window at the Spanish moss-draped oaks of Savannah, blurred by the speed of the car. "I have the wire transfers. I have the deed to the beach house he tried to hide. And Sarah?" "Yes?" I took the Sparrow. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the silver lapel pin. I hadn't just stepped away from the table. When I had leaned in to help Elias with his jacket earlier in the evening, I had unpinned the one thing he actually valued, a family heirloom he had stolen from his own father's estate to give to his mistress, only to wear it tonight as a trophy of his own perceived victory. I looked at the tiny silver bird in my palm. "I'm going to the safe house," I said. "By the time the sun comes up, Elias Thorne St. Clair won't just be looking for his car. He'll be looking for his life." But as the car turned onto the highway, a notification chirped on my phone, an alert from the home security system. Someone was at the front door of the estate. Not Elias, not the kids. The camera showed a man in a dark suit I didn't recognize, holding a manila envelope. He wasn't ringing the bell. He was sliding something under the door. I zoomed in on the screen. The envelope wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't addressed to Elias. It was addressed to the estate of Camille Simone Vaughn, my maiden name, and the word estate. I wasn't dead. But according to the document being slid under my door at the exact moment of my wedding anniversary, someone was very much planning for me to be. The word estate sat in my mind like a stone in a well, sending out ripples that chilled everything they touched. You don't use that word for the living unless you're planning on them being gone. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" the driver asked, catching my eye in the rearview mirror. He was a professional, likely used to picking up distraught women from the Gentry Hotel. But I wasn't weeping. I was sitting perfectly still, my phone held in hands that did not shake, watching the grainy black and white feed of my own front porch on a 4-inch screen. "I'm fine, thank you," I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, a woman who hadn't just watched her 35-year life dissolve into a puddle of buttercream and betrayal. "Please, just keep driving. We're heading to the Isle of Hope address I gave you." I closed the security app. My mind, trained by decades of managing the complex, logistical web of the St. Clair family and the Thorne Vaughn properties, began to sift through the implications. To be in a state, there must be a death. If not a physical one, then a civil one. Elias was a builder. He understood that before you could erect a new, gleaming skyscraper, you had to perform a controlled demolition of the old structure. I was the old structure. I was the historic building with the deep foundation and the sturdy bones that was now standing in the way of his new development. He wasn't just replacing me in his bed. He was trying to bulldoze my existence. My phone began to vibrate in my clutch. Tasha. I let it ring. Then I let it go to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it buzzed again. Jordan. I silenced it. Then came the texts. A flurry of them, lighting up the dark interior of the car like digital fireflies. "Mom, where did you go? That was so embarrassing." "Dad is losing his mind. You can't just leave like that. Saffron is crying." "Mom, pick up. We need to talk about the Bentley. Did you really put the keys in the exhaust?" I looked out the window at the passing streetlights. The arrogance of it was almost breathtaking. They weren't asking if I was okay. They weren't apologizing for the woman who was currently occupying my seat at the head table. They were concerned with the embarrassment. They were concerned with the Bentley. They viewed me as a utility, a power grid. When the lights are on, nobody thinks about the cables buried in the dirt. They only notice the grid when the power goes out and they're left sitting in the dark, unable to charge their precious lives. "We're here, ma'am," the driver said. The car slowed as we pulled onto a narrow gravel drive hemmed in by ancient moss-draped oaks. This wasn't the St. Clair mansion with its 6 bedrooms and its manicured lawn that cost $3,000 a month to maintain. This was a small, white clapboard cottage tucked away on a tidal creek, a property I had purchased 10 years ago using a small inheritance from my great-aunt. Elias didn't know about this place. He thought the money had gone into diversifying our portfolio, which was his code for letting me gamble it on real estate ventures you don't understand. I stepped out of the car. The air here was different. Thick with the scent of salt marsh, plashy water, and the honest decay of nature. It didn't smell like expensive catering and desperation. I tipped the driver generously and waited until his taillights disappeared before I walked up to the porch. I didn't enter through the front. I went to the side, lifted a loose floorboard, and pulled out a heavy waterproof lockbox. Inside the cottage, the air was cool and smelled of cedar and old books. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I moved through the shadows, lighting a single lamp on the roll-top desk in the corner. I sat down and finally opened the planner I had been clutching. I had been the CFO of St. Clair Development for the first 15 years of our marriage. I was the one who had navigated the tax codes, the one who had secured the minority-owned business grants that gave us our first major leg up, and the one who had kept the books clean when Elias wanted to cut corners. When the children were born and Elias grew more successful, he had gently, then firmly, pushed me toward community leadership and matriarchal duties. He told me I was too precious to be bogged down by spreadsheets. He told me I deserved to be the face of the family, not the engine. I had been a fool. I had mistaken his desire to hide his tracks for a desire to protect my peace. I took out the bank statement I'd found. The $600,000 transferred to Saffron LeClaire, LLC. But as I looked closer at the transaction history I had spent the last 3 nights painstakingly reconstructing from the digital crumbs he'd left behind, I saw a pattern I hadn't noticed before. The transfers weren't just going to Saffron. They were being routed through a secondary account, one held in the name of T. St. Clair Associates. Tasha, my daughter, the lawyer, the one who had stood in the ballroom and told me to just give up the seat. I felt a coldness settle in my marrow that no amount of Savannah sun could ever warm. It wasn't just a mistress. It was a liquidation. My own children were helping their father strip the assets I had helped build, likely in exchange for a seat at the new table he was promising them. I reached for my laptop, my fingers flying across the keys. I had kept my old administrative access codes to the company server. Elias was many things: a visionary, a salesman, a charmer, but he was technologically lazy. He assumed that because I spent my days at garden club meetings and charity galas, I had forgotten how to code, how to audit, or how to hunt. He was wrong. While the city of Savannah slept, I began to peel back the layers of the St. Clair empire. I found the life insurance policy first. It was a $10 million key man policy, but it had been amended 6 months ago. I was no longer the beneficiary. The beneficiary had been changed to a trust, the Legacy Foundation. And the trustees of that foundation? Elias, Tasha, and Jordan. But it was the second document I found that made the breath catch in my throat. It was a draft of a legal petition, time-stamped only 2 days ago. Petition for involuntary guardianship and conservatorship of Camille Simone St. Clair. I read the words, my eyes burning in the dim lamplight. The petition alleged that I was suffering from early onset cognitive decline, citing erratic behavior, paranoia regarding family finances, and unexplained absences. It was signed by a doctor I didn't know and supported by affidavits from Elias, Tasha, and Jordan. They weren't just waiting for me to leave. They were planning to lock me in. They wanted the assets, but they didn't want the mess of a divorce. A crazy mother was much easier to manage than a scorned wife with 35 years of corporate secrets. If I were declared incompetent, Elias would have full control over my individual holdings, the lands I'd inherited, the trust my father had left me, the very ground I was standing on. That was why the envelope at the front door was addressed to my estate. In their minds, the woman I was, the woman who built them, was already dead. All that remained was the paperwork. I sat back in the chair, the silence of the cottage pressing in on me. A younger version of me might have screamed. She might have driven back to that ballroom, walked up to that head table, and flipped it over in a shower of crystal and champagne. But I am 62 years old. I have learned that the loudest sound in the world isn't a scream. It's the sound of a woman quietly deciding she is finished. I reached for my phone and dialed Sarah again. Camille? It's nearly 2 a.m. Where are you? I'm at the Creek House, I said. My voice was a whisper, but it was a whisper of steel. Sarah, they're trying to interdict me. They've already filed the paperwork for a conservatorship. I heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath. Sarah was a retired judge. She knew exactly what that meant. They're trying to Brittany you, Camille? Your own children? Tasha wrote the affidavits, I said, staring at the screen. And Elias has been funneling the retirement funds through her firm. They think I'm going to walk away quietly or be dragged away in a white coat. What are you going to do? I looked at the silver sparrow pin sitting on the desk. It caught the light, its tiny beady eye looking back at me. Elias always told me that a good builder knows when a structure is beyond repair, I said. He told me that sometimes the most merciful thing you can do is a controlled burn. You clear the lot so something new can grow. Camille, be careful. If they have a doctor on their side, they have a doctor. But I have the ledger. The ledger was a physical book, a small black moleskin I had kept in the floor safe of our bedroom for 30 years. It contained the real numbers, not the ones we showed the IRS, not the ones we showed the bank, but the ones Elias used to pay off the subcontractors who worked off the books on his municipal projects. It was the map of the bodies he'd buried in the concrete of this city. I'm going to need you to call David, I said. David was David Holloway, my first love. The man I had left for Elias 36 years ago, because Elias was the future, and David was just a public defender. David was now the most feared federal prosecutor in the state. David? Sarah asked, her voice skeptical. Camille, you haven't spoken to that man since the Reagan administration. He told me once that if I ever found myself in a burning building, I should call him and he'd bring the water. Well, the building is on fire, Sarah, and I'm ready to let it burn. I hung up the phone. I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest. For decades, I had carried the weight of being the strong black woman. I had been the one who made sure the bills were paid, the children were cultured, the church was supported, and the husband was respected. I had carried their secrets like lead weights in my pockets, smiling through the pain of his infidelities and the sting of their entitlement. I had been so busy being their foundation that I had forgotten I was a person. I stood up and walked to the window. The tide was coming in, the water silver under the moon. I took off my wedding ring. It was a 5-carat diamond, heavy and cold. I looked at it for a moment. Then I walked to the back door, opened it, and threw the ring into the dark, murky water of the creek. I didn't feel a sense of loss. I felt a sense of aerodynamics. I was stripping the weight. I was becoming something faster, sharper, and far more dangerous than a wife. I went back to the computer. I had one more thing to do before the sun came up. I logged into the St. Clair Development payroll system. If they wanted me to be incompetent, I decided I would give them a taste of what real chaos looked like. With 3 clicks, I suspended all outgoing payments for the next 48 hours. The payroll for the construction crews, the payments to the suppliers, the leases on the heavy machinery. Then, I sent a single email from my official company account to the entire board of directors and the primary investors. Subject: personal leave and financial disclosure. To my colleagues and friends, Due to unforeseen circumstances discussed at my 35th anniversary tonight, I am stepping down as the managing partner of Thorne Vaughn Holdings, effective immediately. Attached, you will find the initial audit of the Legacy Foundation transfers. I wish Mr. St. Clair and his new associate, Miss LeClaire, the best of luck in explaining these discrepancies to you in the morning. Warmly, Camille Simone Vaughn. I hit send. The silence that followed was heavy. Within seconds, my phone began to scream. It wasn't just Tasha and Jordan anymore. It was the board. It was the bank. It was Elias. I turned the phone off and placed it face down on the desk. I walked to the small kitchenette, put on a kettle of tea, and sat in the dark, watching the sun begin to bleed over the horizon. Around 6 a.m., a car pulled into the gravel drive. I didn't move. I didn't hide. I watched through the window as a tall, broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair got out of a sensible black sedan. He was wearing a trench coat over a suit that looked like it had seen a long night. He didn't go to the front door. He walked around to the side porch just like I had. He stood there for a moment, looking at the water. Then he turned and saw me through the glass. David Holloway didn't smile. He just nodded, a slow, solemn movement of his head that said, "I'm here, and I brought the water." But as I moved to unlock the door, I saw something else. Behind David's car, another vehicle was pulling in. A sleek, silver SUV I recognized all too well. Tasha. She wasn't alone. In the passenger seat was a man in a white coat, the doctor from the petition. They weren't coming to talk. They were coming with the papers. They were coming to take me. I looked at David, then at the SUV. "Camille!" Tasha's voice rang out as she stepped out of the car, her face a mask of faux concern that didn't reach her eyes. "Mom, please! We know you're in there! We just want to help you! You're not well!" I turned to David as he reached the door. "How fast can you file a counter-injunction?" I asked as I turned the deadbolt. David looked at Tasha, then back at me. A grim, predatory smile touched his lips. "In this county? About 20 minutes. But Camille..." "Yes?" "If we do this, there is no going back. You won't just be leaving him. You'll be dismantling him. And the kids, too." I looked at my daughter, who was currently pointing at me and talking to the doctor, her face twisted in a way that made her look exactly like her father. I thought about the 35 years of grandma I had earned and how easily they had handed it to a stranger. "They already dismantled me, David," I said, opening the door. "Now, it's just a matter of who handles the debris." But then, the doctor did something unexpected. He didn't look at me. He looked at Tasha, then he looked at his phone. "Wait," the doctor said, his voice carrying in the quiet morning air. "Miss St. Clair, the police just issued an alert. It's about your father." Tasha froze. "What? What about my father?" The doctor looked up, his face pale. "There's been an accident. At the hotel. The Bentley. It didn't just have the keys in the exhaust, Camille." I felt a sudden, sharp prickle of ice at the base of my neck. I hadn't put anything else in that car. "What happened?" I asked, stepping out onto the porch. "The car exploded when he tried to start it," the doctor said. "Elias is alive, but..." Saffron was in the passenger seat. I looked at David. He looked as stunned as I was. And then I remembered the man in the dark suit at my front door, the one who had delivered the estate envelope. He hadn't just been delivering a message. He had been finishing a job. The morning fog rolled off the tidal creek like a thick gray shroud, clinging to the hem of my silk gown. I stood on the porch of the cottage, watching my daughter. Tasha's face had gone from a mask of calculated concern to a portrait of sheer, unadulterated terror. But it wasn't the terror of a daughter fearing for her father's life. It was the terror of a shareholder watching the stock price plummet. "The Bentley?" Tasha whispered, her voice cracking. "The Bentley exploded? Mom, what did you do?" She turned her gaze on me, her eyes narrowing. Behind her, the doctor, a man whose name I now saw on a clipboard was Dr. Eris Thorne, a distant cousin of Elias's I hadn't seen in a decade, stepped back toward the SUV. He was realizing, quite quickly, that he had signed up for a quiet, legal kidnapping, not a murder investigation. "I didn't do anything, Tasha," I said, my voice steady, carrying over the marsh like a tolling bell. "I told the valet where the keys were. If your father chose to go to the car with his companion, that was his choice." "You told Marcus the keys were in the exhaust!" Tasha shouted, taking a step toward the porch. "Everyone heard you! You practically announced that you'd tampered with it!" David Holloway moved then. He didn't rush. He simply stepped in front of me, his large frame creating a wall of charcoal wool between me and my daughter's venom. "Miss St. Clair," David said, his voice the deep, resonant baritone that had sent dozens of corrupt politicians to federal prison. "I suggest you stop speaking immediately. You are currently standing on private property belonging solely to Camille Vaughn. You are accompanied by a medical professional attempting to execute a guardianship petition based on affidavits you signed under penalty of perjury. And now, you are attempting to level a criminal accusation without a shred of evidence." Tasha recoiled as if he'd slapped her. She recognized him now. Everyone in the legal community knew David Holloway. "David?" she stammered. "What are you doing here? This is a family matter." "It ceased to be a family matter the moment you tried to strip your mother of her civil liberties to protect your father's embezzlement," David replied. He looked at the doctor. "Dr. Thorne, I'd advise you to get in that vehicle and drive away. If you're still here when the sun is fully up, I'll have the medical board reviewing your credentials by noon." The doctor didn't wait for a second invitation. He climbed into the passenger seat and slammed the door. Tasha stood alone on the gravel. The high-powered attorney, the woman I had groomed for greatness, looked suddenly small against the backdrop of the ancient oaks. For 30 years, she had relied on the fact that I was the unbreakable foundation, the one who would always forgive, always provide, and always absorb the blow. She was realizing that the foundation had moved. "Mom," she pleaded, her voice shifting back into that manipulative little girl tone she used when she wanted a loan or a favor. "Dad is hurt. Saffron, they don't know if she's going to make it. You have to come to the hospital. If you don't show up, it looks like guilt. We can fix this. We can pull the petition. We can say it was all a misunderstanding caused by the stress of the anniversary." "Fix it?" I asked, stepping out from behind David. I walked to the edge of the porch, looking down at her. "You want to fix the fact that you signed a document claiming I was losing my mind? You want to fix the fact that you helped your father steal $600,000 from my retirement to pay for his Mistress's LLC? Or do you just want to fix the optics so your inheritance doesn't vanish in a cloud of smoke?" "That's not fair!" Tasha cried. "Fairness left the building last night when Leo called that woman Grandma," I said. "You didn't just let him say it, Tasha. You coached him. I saw the way you looked at her. You've been having Sunday dinners with her for months, haven't you? In the house, I paid for. At the table, I polished." Tasha didn't deny it. She couldn't. The guilt was written in the stiff line of her shoulders. Go to the hospital, Tasha, I said, turning my back on her. Go be with your father. If he's conscious, tell him I'm not coming. And tell him that the Bentley was fine when I left it. If it blew up, he should look into the people he's been doing business with lately, not the wife he tried to discard. Mom! Goodbye, Tasha. I walked back into the cottage and closed the door. The sound of the SUV peeling away in the gravel was the most beautiful music I had heard in years. I leaned against the door, my eyes closed. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a hollow, aching exhaustion. Camille, David said softly. He was standing by the desk, looking at the silver sparrow pin. You're shaking. I'm not, I lied, though my hands were vibrating like plucked strings. I'm thinking about that man. The one on your security feed? Yes, the one with the envelope. I walked over to the desk and picked up the manila package that had been slid under the door of the main estate. I hadn't opened it yet. I had been too focused on the estate label on the front. David watched me as I tore the seal. Inside wasn't a legal petition. It wasn't a summons. It was a stack of photographs. They were grainy, long lens shots taken in the dark. They showed Elias meeting with a man in a nondescript warehouse down by the Savannah port. In the photos, Elias was handing over a briefcase. The other man was someone I recognized instantly, not from my social circle, but from the headlines. Silas Vance, the man whose construction company had lost every major city contract to St. Clair Development over the last 5 years. There had been rumors of a blood feud between the two families, a rivalry that had turned bitter and personal. But in these photos, they weren't fighting. They were shaking hands. Underneath the photos was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. He wasn't replacing you, Camille. He was selling you. The Legacy Foundation wasn't for the kids. It was the buyout price for Thorne Vaughn Holdings. Vance takes the land, Elias takes the girl, and you take the blame for the bankruptcy. He planned the accident for the anniversary, but he was supposed to be the one who escaped. Look at the tires. I felt the room tilt. David, I whispered, handing him the note. He wasn't just trying to put me in a home. He was selling my family's land to Silas Vance. The Vaughn estates. The marshlands my grandfather left me. David scanned the note, his face hardening into a mask of professional fury. If he was selling to Vance, he was violating 6 federal antitrust laws, not to mention the terms of your father's trust. But Camille, look at this part. He planned the accident, but he was supposed to be the one who escaped. I looked back at the photos. In the corner of one shot, I saw the Bentley. But it wasn't in the hotel parking lot. It was at a mechanic shop I didn't recognize. He tampered with the car himself, I realized, the horror dawning on me. He meant for the car to have an accident while I was driving it. Maybe not an explosion, maybe a brake failure on the bridge. He wanted me gone, permanently. But I left the party early. I took a car service. And he was so arrogant, David added, that he forgot he'd rigged it, or he thought he'd fixed it. When you made that scene and walked out, he must have panicked. He went to the car to check it or to move it before the accident could happen, and he took Saffron with him. The weight of it was staggering. Elias hadn't just been unfaithful. He had been predatory. He had looked at 35 years of marriage and seen nothing but an obstacle to be cleared. I walked to the window and looked out at the creek. The sun was finally breaking through the fog, turning the water into a sheet of hammered gold. I thought about the woman I had been yesterday, the woman who worried about the thread count of the linens and the temperature of the soup. I thought about the woman who had smiled through the subtle stings of her children's entitlement, thinking that if she just gave a little more, they would finally see her. That woman was dead. Elias had gotten his wish in a way. He had killed the wife, but he had no idea what he had birthed in her place. "What now?" David asked. He was standing close now, the scent of cedar and old-school integrity radiating from him. "I can take this to the bureau. We can have a team on Elias's hospital room by breakfast. We can freeze every asset connected to Vance." I turned to him. I felt a strange, cold calm. The kind of calm that comes after the storm has already leveled the house. "No," I said. David frowned. "No? Camille, he tried to kill you." "If you take it to the bureau now, it becomes a criminal case. The assets get frozen for years. The lawyers will eat everything that's left of my family's legacy. Tasha will find a way to pivot. Jordan will claim ignorance, and Elias will play the victim in a hospital bed." I walked back to the desk and picked up the silver sparrow. "I want him to watch it happen," I said. "I want him to sit in that hospital bed, tethered to those machines, and watch as I systematically dismantle everything he ever built. I want him to see Saffron walk away with nothing. I want him to see his children come to me for their allowance, only to find the bank is closed." "And Silas Vance?" "Vance wants my land," I said. "Let's give him a reason to regret he ever heard the name Vaughn." I looked at David. "You said you brought the water, David. Are you ready to help me start the fire?" David looked at me for a long time. He saw the shift in my eyes, the loss of the grace and the arrival of the grit. "I've been waiting 36 years for you to ask me that," he said. My phone, which had been sitting face down on the desk, suddenly began to pulse with a new notification. Not a call, not a text. It was an automated alert from the St. Clair Development internal server. "Security breach. Unauthenticated access detected in cryptographic vault." I frowned. I suspended the payroll, but I didn't touch the vault. That's where the property deeds are digitized. I quickly logged in. My heart hammered against my ribs. Someone wasn't just stealing money anymore. They were erasing the digital records of the land ownership. "It's Tasha," I whispered, watching the logs. "She's at the office. She isn't at the hospital. She went straight to the server room." My daughter wasn't mourning. She was looting the wreckage before the authorities arrived. I looked at David. "We need to go," I said. "Now." "To the office?" "No," I said, a predatory smile finally touching my lips. "To the one place Tasha can't follow. The physical vault at the First Savannah Bank. The one my father told me never to open unless the world was ending." I grabbed my coat. "The world ended last night, David. It's time to see what's left in the ruins." But as we walked to the door, a heavy black sedan pulled into the drive, blocking David's car. The door opened and a man stepped out. It was the man in the dark suit from the security camera. He didn't have an envelope this time. He had a gun. And he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at David. "Holloway," the man said, his voice like gravel grinding on stone. "You should have stayed in Atlanta. This doesn't concern the feds." David stepped in front of me, his hand reaching into the small of his back. "It concerns me when you threaten a Vaughn, Miller. Put it away. You're out of your league." "Vance doesn't think so," the man named Miller said. "He wants the sparrow, Camille. Hand it over, and maybe you get to keep the cottage." I looked at the silver pin in my hand. It wasn't a family heirloom. It was a key. I looked at the silver sparrow in my palm, its tiny wings frozen in a mid-flight curve. For years I had seen it pinned to Elias's Sunday suits, a quiet symbol of his supposedly humble beginnings. He'd told me it was a gift from his grandfather, a sharecropper who had saved pennies to buy a piece of silver. It was a story that sold well in Savannah, the myth of the self-made man with the modest heirloom. But looking at Miller, the man Vance had sent to retrieve it, I realized the sparrow was no more a family heirloom than I was a satisfied wife. "You're standing on private property, Miller," David said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming the sound of a closing cell door. He hadn't pulled a weapon yet, but his posture was a warning. "And you're brandishing a firearm in front of a federal officer. Do you really want to spend the next 20 years in a box because Silas Vance sent you on a fool's errand?" Miller's eyes flickered to David's hand, which remained tucked behind his back. Miller was a man in his 50s, graying at the temples, wearing the kind of suit that looked expensive until you saw the fraying at the cuffs. He was a professional, yes, but he was a desperate one. I recognized him then, not just from the headlines, but from the donor lists. 10 years ago, he'd been a captain in the Savannah PD until a procedural error cost him his badge. Now he was the muscle for the men who didn't want to get their hands dirty. "I don't want a body, Holloway," Miller said, his gaze shifting to me. "I just want the bird. Mrs. St. Clair, you're a smart woman. You've spent 30 years playing the part of the dutiful wife. Why start a war now? Your husband is in the ICU. Your daughter is at the office trying to save what's left, and you're standing here in a silk dress with a man who can't protect you from what's coming." "Is that what you think this is, Miller?" I asked. I took a step forward, moving past the protection of David's shoulder. I heard David's sharp intake of breath, but I didn't stop. I was still in my anniversary gown, the champagne silk stained at the hem with marsh mud and gravel. My hair, which had been styled into a perfect, impenetrable crown by the best salon in the city, was beginning to lose its shape. I should have felt vulnerable. Instead, I felt like I was finally wearing the right skin. "You think I'm playing a part?" I continued, my voice cold and clear. "I'm not playing anything. For 35 years, I was the engine of that family. I was the one who kept the peace, who kept the books, and who kept men like you from ever seeing the cracks in Elias's foundation. If Silas Vance wants this sparrow, it's because he knows it's the only thing left that proves he and Elias were stealing from the city's pension fund." Miller's hand wavered. Only for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Elias was a builder," I said, walking slowly toward the man with the gun. "But Silas Vance is a scavenger. He didn't just want the St. Clair land. He wanted the records. He wanted to make sure that when the St. Clair Empire fell, it landed right on top of me, leaving him clean. But there's a problem with that plan." I stopped 6 feet from him. Miller was sweatier now. The morning sun was hitting the gravel, and the humidity was beginning to rise. "The problem is that you're asking for a key you don't know how to use," I said, holding up the sparrow. "This isn't just a piece of silver. It's a physical authenticator for the vault at First Savannah. And that vault doesn't just open with a key. It opens with a biometric. My father's biometric. And since he's gone, it opens with mine." It was a lie. A beautiful, calculated lie. My father had been a traditionalist, a man who trusted steel and ink more than computers. But he hadn't been a high-tech visionary. But Miller didn't know that. Silas Vance didn't know that. They only knew that the Vaughn family had secrets that had stayed buried for 80 years. "So," I said, my heart drumming a steady, warlike rhythm in my chest, "you can shoot us both, but then the sparrow becomes nothing more than a piece of scrap metal. Or you can get in your car, drive back to Silas, and tell him that if he wants to negotiate for his freedom, he needs to talk to my lawyer." I gestured to David. Miller looked at David. He looked at me. He looked at the gun in his hand as if he were seeing it for the first time. The calculus of the situation was changing. He was no longer looking at an easy mark. He was looking at a witness who knew more than his boss had told him. "Vance is going to kill me if I come back empty-handed," Miller muttered. "Vance is going to be too busy talking to the FBI to worry about you," David intervened. "Miller, walk away. This is your one chance to be a witness instead of a co-conspirator. Give me the peace." For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the wind in the marsh grass and the distant cry of a gull. Then, slowly, Miller lowered the gun. He didn't hand it over. He tucked it back into his holster and spat on the gravel. "You're a piece of work, Camille," he said, his voice thick with a strange kind of respect. "No wonder Elias was scared of you." "Elias wasn't scared of me," I said, as Miller turned toward his car. "He was just blind. He thought my grace was a weakness. He's about to find out it was a choice." We watched as Miller backed his sedan out of the drive, the tires spitting gravel. Only when his car was a speck on the highway did David let out a long, ragged breath. "A biometric lie, Camille?" he asked, looking at me with a mixture of awe and concern. "You've been watching too many movies." "I've been watching men lie to me for 35 years, David. I've learned the cadence of it." I looked at the sparrow. "We need to get to the bank. If Miller realizes I'm bluffing, or if Vance sends someone less reasonable, we won't get another chance." "My car is blocked," David said, looking at the way Miller had churned up the gravel. "I can get it out, but it'll take a few minutes." "We don't have minutes. Use the cottage car." I led him to the small detached garage behind the cottage. Inside was a pristine 20-year-old Mercedes-Benz E-Class, midnight blue. It had been my father's car, the one he'd left to me in a separate codicil Elias hadn't bothered to read because he thought it was old junk. I climbed into the driver's seat. The smell of the leather, old, expensive, and comforting, wrapped around me like a hug from a man who had actually loved me. I turned the key. The engine purred to life with a quiet German precision that put Elias's flashy Bentley to shame. "You're driving?" David asked, sliding into the passenger seat. "It's my city, David. You'll just get stuck in the tourist traffic on Bay Street." I drove with a focus I hadn't felt in decades. As we wound our way through the oak-lined streets toward the historic district, my mind was a whirlwind of strategic maneuvers. I wasn't just thinking about the bank. I was thinking about the Legacy Foundation. I was thinking about the $600,000. I was thinking about Tasha, my daughter. The sting of her betrayal was a physical ache, a dull throb behind my eyes. I had raised her to be a warrior. I had taught her that a Black woman in this country has to be twice as good to get half as much. I had given her everything: the best schools, the best clothes, the best connections. And she had used those tools to help her father bury me. "She thinks she's winning," I said aloud, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Tasha?" David asked softly. "She thinks that because she's young and modern, she can outmaneuver me. She thinks I'm a relic, a decorative object that Elias kept on the mantle." "Tasha is smart," David said, "but she's arrogant. She's Elias's daughter in that way. She thinks she's the only one who knows where the bodies are buried. She doesn't realize you're the one who bought the shovels. We reached the First Savannah Bank at 8:45 a.m. The bank was a neoclassical fortress of granite and brass, a temple to the old money that still ran the city beneath the surface. I parked the Mercedes in a no-parking zone directly in front of the entrance. "You can't park here, Camille," David said. "Watch me." I stepped out of the car. I was still in my mud-stained anniversary gown. I was a 62-year-old woman with messy hair and no makeup. But as I walked up the marble steps, I pulled my shoulders back and tilted my chin up. The security guard at the door, a man named Arthur who had opened the door for my father for 40 years, blinked in surprise. "Mrs. Saint." "Claire?" he stammered. Is everything all right? We heard about the accident at the hotel." "I'm quite well, Arthur," I said, my voice dripping with the quiet authority of a woman who owned the ground she walked on. "I need to see Mr. Sterling immediately, in the private vault area." "Mr. Sterling is in a meeting, ma'am, and the bank doesn't officially open for 15 minutes. "Arthur," I said, stopping and looking him directly in the eye. "Tell Mr. Sterling that Camille Vaughn is here, not Mrs. St. Clair, Camille Vaughn. And tell him that if he isn't in the vault lobby in 3 minutes, I'll be calling the state comptroller to discuss the St. Clair development audit." Arthur's eyes went wide. "Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am." David followed me into the lobby, his footsteps echoing on the polished stone. "You're leaning into the Vaughn name pretty hard today." "It's the only thing I have left that Elias couldn't ruin," I said. "He spent 30 years trying to make me a St. Clair. He wanted the prestige of my family name without the burden of my family's history. He's about to find out that you can't have one without the other." 3 minutes later, Julian Sterling, the bank's president, hurried into the lobby. He was a man of 80 who looked like he'd been carved out of a piece of dry cedar. He saw me, saw my dress, and then saw David Holloway. "Camille," Julian said, his voice hushed. "What on earth is happening? The news says Elias is in the hospital. The police were here an hour ago asking about company accounts." "The police were here?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "Yes, they had a warrant to freeze the St. Clair Development payroll account. Something about a suspicious explosion and a possible insurance fraud investigation." I looked at David. This was faster than we'd anticipated. Elias's accident had triggered a cascade that was already threatening to drown the firm. "Did they freeze the Vaughn Trust, Julian?" I asked. Julian hesitated. "They tried, but your father set that trust up with a triple-blind structure. Only the primary beneficiary can authorize a freeze or a withdrawal. I told them I couldn't touch it without your physical presence and the secondary authenticator." He looked at the silver sparrow I was holding. "You have it," he whispered. "I have it," I said. "Take me down." The vault at First Savannah wasn't a room full of safety deposit boxes. It was a subterranean cathedral. We went down a private elevator, through 2 layers of steel gates, and into a small, climate-controlled room that smelled of dust and old paper. In the center of the room was a single, large box made of dark, heavy iron. It didn't have a keypad. It didn't have a digital screen. It had a small, sparrow-shaped indentation in the lid. I looked at David. "Stay here." "Camille." "I need to do this alone, David. It's the only way." He nodded and stepped back outside the gate with Julian. I turned to the box. My hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. For 35 years, I had walked past this bank, knowing this box was here, but I had never felt worthy enough to open it. My father had told me on his deathbed, "Camille, You're a Vaughn. You're the foundation. But don't ever open that box unless the man you're building with turns out to be a ghost." I had thought he was being cynical. I had thought he didn't understand the modern love I had with Elias. I was wrong. My father had seen Elias for exactly what he was, a ghost who had haunted my life and hollowed out my soul. I placed the silver sparrow into the indentation. It fit with a satisfying, heavy thunk. I turned the bird 90 degrees to the right. A series of internal gears began to groan. The lid of the box didn't pop open. It slid back with a slow, grinding sound. Inside weren't stacks of cash. There were no gold bars. There was a single, thick envelope made of vellum and a small, handheld digital recording device that looked like it was from the late 90s. I picked up the envelope. It was addressed to "My dearest Camille." I opened it. "Camille, if you are reading this, then the sparrow has returned to its nest. It means Elias has finally shown you the face he's been hiding. I am sorry, my daughter. I wanted to protect you from the truth while I was alive, but I knew you wouldn't believe me until you saw it for yourself. Inside this box, you will find the original deeds to the Savannah marshlands. Not the ones Elias has been showing the board, the real ones. The ones that prove that the land he's been developing for 30 years never belonged to St. Clair Development. It belongs to a trust held in your name and your name alone. Elias has been leasing it from you for $1 a year through a shell company I created. But more importantly, you will find the recording. It's from 36 years ago, the night before your wedding. I felt a coldness wash over me. I reached for the digital recorder. My fingers found the play button. The audio was grainy, filled with the hiss of background noise, but the voices were unmistakable. "I'm telling you, Silas, it's a done deal," Elias's voice said. Younger, hungrier, but with that same oily charm. "Once I marry the Vaughn girl, the land is as good as ours. Her father is old. He won't last another year. We'll merge the holdings, bankrupt the Vaughn side, and move the assets to the new firm. She'll never know. She's too busy looking at wedding veils to look at the books." "And if she finds out?" Silas Vance's voice asked. "She won't. I've got her convinced I'm the only one who sees her. I'll give her a couple of kids, keep her busy with the social circuit, and by the time she realizes the foundation is gone, there won't be enough left for her to sue for." The recording clicked off. I stood in the silence of the vault, the sound of my husband's 36-year-old betrayal echoing in my ears. It wasn't just a recent mistress. It wasn't just a recent embezzlement. My entire life, every anniversary, every birthday, every child I had birthed, every sacrifice I had made had been a transaction. I hadn't been a wife. I had been a long-term investment that he had finally decided to liquidate. I looked at the recording device. Then I looked at the original deeds. If Elias had been leasing the land from me for $1 a year, and he had been selling that land to Silas Vance, then he wasn't just guilty of embezzlement. He was guilty of fraud on a scale that would bankrupt both of them 10 times over. And Tasha was a partner in the firm. If she had signed off on the Vance deal, she wasn't just a daughter helping her father. She was a co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar fraud against her own mother's trust. I felt a strange, terrifying shift in my heart. The sadness was gone. The exhaustion was gone. In its place was a cold, incandescent rage that felt like a superpower. I walked back to the gate. Julian and David were watching me. "Camille?" David asked, his voice full of concern. "What's in the box?" I looked at him. I looked at Julian. "The truth, David," I said. I turned to Julian Sterling. "Julian, I need you to do two things. First, I want you to initiate a total clawback of every cent paid to St. Clair Development from the Vaughn Trust over the last 35 years. Cite a breach of fiduciary duty and the original lease agreement." Julian's jaw dropped. "Camille, that's tens of millions of dollars. The company will collapse instantly. The payroll, the subcontractors, the projects, everything will stop." "Good," I said. "Let it stop." I looked at David. "And the second thing, Julian? I want you to call the local news stations. Tell them that Camille Vaughn is holding a press conference on the steps of the bank in 1 hour. I have a recording the city might find interesting." "Camille, wait," David said, stepping forward. "You can't just go public with this. If you do, Tasha and Jordan go down with him. They're your children." I looked at David. For a moment, I saw the man who had loved me 36 years ago, the man who wanted to protect me. "They stopped being my children the moment they tried to declare me incompetent to steal my father's land, David," I said. "They chose their father's side. They chose the legacy. Now, they get to see exactly what that legacy is built on." I walked past him toward the elevator. "Where are you going?" David called out. "To the office," I said. "I have a daughter to fire." But as I reached the lobby, my phone, which I had turned back on, began to scream with notifications. Not from Tasha, not from the bank. It was a news alert. "Breaking. St. Clair Development Headquarters on fire. Police suspect arson. One person reported trapped inside the server room." I froze. The server room, where Tasha had been looting the files. Silas Vance wasn't just trying to steal the land. He was burning the evidence, and he was burning my daughter with it. The world has a way of becoming very quiet when it's burning. I stood in the marble lobby of the First Savannah Bank, the weight of my father's vellum envelope in one hand, and the digital evidence of my husband's 36-year lie in the other. Around me, the bank continued its morning ritual, the hushed whispers of tellers, the chime of the elevator, the scent of expensive floor wax. But on the television screen mounted behind the reception desk, my life was being reduced to ash in high definition. The St. Clair Development Headquarters, a glass and steel monument to Elias's ego, was vomiting thick, oily plumes of black smoke into the pristine Savannah sky. "Camille, we have to go," David said, his hand firm on my elbow. "The fire department is there, but if Tasha is inside—" I didn't move. I watched the screen. I saw the fire licking at the floor I knew so well. The executive suite, the mahogany-paneled hallways, and the server room at the very back, a windowless bunker designed to survive a hurricane, but not, apparently, a betrayal. "She was there to erase the files," I whispered. My voice sounded hollow, echoing from a place deep inside me that felt like a cave. She was trying to protect him. Even after everything, she was still his soldier. "She's your daughter, Camille," David said, his voice urgent. I looked at him. I saw the fear in his eyes, the fear that I had finally, truly, lost my heart. He was looking at a woman who had just discovered her entire marriage was a shell game, and he was worried I would let the arsonist finish what the accident started. "I know who she is, David," I said. I tucked the vellum envelope into my clutch. "Let's go." I didn't drive the Mercedes like a woman in a panic. I drove it like a woman on a mission. We bypassed the police cordons on Drayton Street, my father's old car cutting through the traffic with a spectral grace. When a young officer tried to wave us back, I simply rolled down the window and fixed him with the look I usually reserved for people who tried to cut in the communion line. "I am Camille St. Clair," I said, my voice like chilled velvet. "My daughter is in that building. Move the barricade." He moved it. The heat hit us before we even stepped out of the car. It was a physical wall, smelling of melting plastic, scorched paper, and the bitter tang of accelerant. The street was a graveyard of fire hoses and emergency lights, and there, huddled by a paramedics truck, was Jordan, my son, my firstborn. The boy I had taught to read by the light of a bedside lamp, the man who had sat at a table last night and toasted to his father's 35 years of deceit. He was covered in soot, his expensive suit jacket gone, his face a mask of hysterical, trembling weakness. When he saw me, he didn't run to me. He shrank back. "Mom," he choked out, coughing into a damp cloth. I tried to get to her. The door, it was locked from the outside. The server room door, it wouldn't open." I walked up to him. I didn't hug him. I didn't offer him comfort. I stood over him, the smoke swirling around my champagne gown like the ghosts of 1,000 Sunday dinners. "Locked from the outside, Jordan?" I asked. "I heard her screaming," he sobbed, his eyes darting toward the building. She said she found something. She said Dad lied about the insurance. And then the fire started in the hallway. I couldn't get back to her." "Where was the security?" David asked, stepping forward, his professional instincts overriding the chaos. "This building has a 24-hour detail." "They were gone," Jordan said, looking up at David. "They said Silas Vance called them off, said there was an emergency at the port site." David looked at me. The pieces were clicking into place with a sickening, metallic sound. Silas Vance wasn't just burning the evidence. He was pruning the branches of the St. Clair tree that could still bear witness. Elias was in the ICU. Saffron was broken. And Tasha was the only one with the legal expertise to connect the dots between the St. Clair fraud and Vance's empire. She had outlived her usefulness to the men she had chosen over me. "The server room has an independent ventilation shaft," I said, turning back to the building. "Camille, no," David warned. "The fire department is going in. You stay here." "The fire department doesn't know the layout of the archives, David. They'll go through the front. The server room is accessible through the basement freight elevator, the one Elias used to move the off-the-books materials." I didn't wait for his permission. I headed toward the side entrance, the service door that looked like nothing more than a maintenance closet. "Jordan!" I called out over my shoulder. My son looked up, startled. "You stayed outside while your sister burned," I said, my voice slicing through the roar of the fire. "If you want to ever call yourself a Vaughn again, you'll find the captain of that fire crew and tell him about the basement access. Now!" Jordan scrambled to his feet, fueled by a mixture of shame and terror. I reached the service door. It was hot to the touch, the metal vibrating with the inferno raging floors above. I pulled the silver sparrow from my bag. For 30 years, I had thought this was just a trinket. But my father had been the one who designed the security for this building's foundation. He hadn't trusted Elias even then. There was a small, hidden keyway beneath the handle. I inserted the sparrow's beak. The door clicked open. The air inside was thick, but the fire hadn't reached the basement yet. It was descending. I could hear the groan of the steel beams above me, the sound of a giant's bones snapping. "Camille!" David was behind me, his coat wrapped around his face. "This is suicide!" "It's motherhood, David. There's a difference." We moved through the dark, the only light coming from the emergency red lanterns that flickered like dying eyes. We reached the freight elevator. The power was out, but there was a manual crank, a relic of my father's obsession with being prepared for the end of the world. We worked in silence, the physical strain of the crank pulling at the muscles in my back, the heat pressing down on us like a heavy blanket. When the doors finally creaked open at the server level, a wave of gray smoke rolled out to greet us. "Tasha!" I screamed. At first, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire above, then a faint, rhythmic thud. "Mom?" The voice was tiny. It didn't sound like the high-powered attorney. It sounded like the 6-year-old girl who used to hide under the dining room table when the thunder got too loud. We found her huddled in the far corner of the server room. The glass partitions had shattered from the heat, and the servers, the machines that held the digital lifeblood of our family, were melting, dripping black plastic like tears. Tasha was clutching a single, hard-shell external drive to her chest. Her face was blackened with soot, her silk blouse scorched. "The door," she gasped, pointing to the heavy steel entrance. Someone bolted it from the hallway. I saw the shadow, Mom. It wasn't Silas, it was Miller, the man who works for Dad." I froze. Miller. The man who had just confronted us at the cottage. The man David said was a scavenger. "He said Dad sent him," Tasha whispered, her eyes wide and glassy. "He said Dad didn't want anyone left to testify about the Legacy Foundation. He said I was a liability." The betrayal hit me then, sharper than any fire. Elias hadn't just tried to dispose of me. In his narcissism, in his desperate bid to save his own skin, he had authorized the clearing of his own daughter. He had seen his children not as flesh and blood, but as witnesses, and witnesses could be eliminated. "Get up, Tasha," I said, my voice dropping into a register of pure, crystalline command. David hoisted her up, her legs nearly giving out. I grabbed her arm, my fingers sinking into the scorched fabric of her sleeve. "Give me the drive," I said. "No," she whimpered, clutching it tighter. "This is the only thing that proves I didn't know, Mom. I found the emails. Dad was framing me. He was putting my digital signature on the Vance contracts. If this burns, I go to jail." I looked at my daughter, the girl who had told me to give up my seat, the girl who had coached my grandchildren to call a mistress Grandma. She was terrified, broken, and currently holding the only thing that could save her career. And I realized in that moment that I had the power to let it burn. If that drive disappeared, Tasha would be ruined. She would be the scapegoat for her father's sins. She would feel the weight of the world she had helped build as it collapsed on her. It would be a perfect, poetic justice. I looked at the flames beginning to lick through the ceiling tiles. I looked at Tasha's desperate, tear-streaked face. Then, I reached out and took the drive from her hands. "Mom, please," she begged. I didn't answer her. I tucked the drive into the secret pocket of my gown, the one my dressmaker had added for my phone, but which now held the destruction of the St. Clair name. "David, get her to the elevator," I said. We made it out just as the first floor collapsed into the lobby. We burst through the service door into the morning air, coughing, lungs screaming for oxygen, our skins stinging from the heat. The firemen swarmed us. Paramedics grabbed Tasha, whisking her away toward an ambulance. Jordan ran toward her, his face a mask of performative grief. I stood apart from them. I stood on the sidewalk, the champagne silk of my gown now black and shredded, a ruined queen in a kingdom of ash. David was beside me, his hand on my shoulder. "You saved her, Camille." "I saved the witness, David," I said. "There's a difference." I felt the weight of the drive against my hip. I felt the vellum envelope in my hand. I looked up and saw a black sedan parked across the street. Not Miller's car, a different one. The tinted window rolled down just an inch. I saw a pair of gold-rimmed sunglasses and a flash of a silver sparrow pin on a lapel. It wasn't Miller, and it wasn't Silas Vance. It was Elias. The hospital report had said he was in the ICU. They said he was unconscious, his body broken by the explosion. But as the sedan pulled away into the smoke-filled traffic, I realized the accident at the hotel hadn't been a failure of his plan. It had been the first act of his disappearance. Elias Thorne St. Clair wasn't dying. He was ghosting. He had burned the building, tried to burn his daughter, and now he was leaving the city with the millions he'd stolen, leaving me to hold the bag for the arson, the fraud, and the fallout. He thought he was free. He thought he'd left the strong black woman behind to clean up his mess one last time. I reached into my pocket and touched the drive. Then I touched the silver sparrow key. I looked at David. "He's not in the hospital, David," I said. David frowned. "What?" The police confirmed what a man like Elias wanted them to confirm. He's in a black sedan, heading toward the private airfield. He thinks he's won. I turned toward the bank, which was still standing, solid and silent, 2 blocks away. "He forgot one thing," I said. "What?" "He forgot that you can't build a life on a foundation you don't own. And he forgot that I'm not the backbone of this family anymore." "Then what are you?" I looked at the ruins of the St. Clair building. I thought about the 35 years of silence, the 35 years of grace. "I'm the reckoning," I said. I walked toward the Mercedes. "David, call your friends at the FAA. Tell them a private jet registered to Thorne Vaughn Holdings is attempting an unauthorized departure. And tell them the primary owner of that jet, Camille Vaughn, is reporting it stolen." "Camille, if we stop that plane, he'll be arrested on the tarmac. Everything comes out. The mistress, the fraud, the fire, the kids' involvement." I opened the car door. "Good," I said. "I want the world to see him in handcuffs. I want them to see the pillar of the community for the hollow man he is. And I want Tasha and Jordan to watch as their inheritance is read the Miranda rights." I sat in the driver's seat. I looked in the rearview mirror. My face was smudged with soot. My eyes were red from the smoke. But for the first time in 35 years, I recognized the woman looking back at me. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a grandma. She was a Vaughn. I started the engine. "Wait," I said, looking at the dash. "What is it?" David asked. "The sparrow," I said, looking at the silver pin. I realized now why it was a sparrow. Elias had told me it was because they were humble birds. But I remembered what my father had actually told me about sparrows. "They're the only birds that can find their way home in a storm, Camille, because they don't look at the sky, they look at the ground. They know exactly where the foundation is." I put the car in gear. "Let's go catch a ghost," I said. But as we pulled away, my phone buzzed in the center console. A message from an unknown number. "The plane was a distraction, Camille. Look at the children's accounts again. He didn't take the money. They did." I stopped the car. I looked at the ambulance where Tasha was being treated. I looked at Jordan, who was talking to a detective, looking every bit the grieving son. The fire wasn't to cover Elias's tracks. It was to cover theirs. My children hadn't been victims of their father's plan. They had been the architects of his exit. And they had just used me to save the only thing that could incriminate them. The drive in my pocket wasn't Tasha's salvation. It was the offshore account access for the $600,000 and the millions that followed. They hadn't just called another woman grandma. They had already sold their mother for a seat at a table that didn't even exist. They had already sold their mother for a seat at a table that didn't even exist. The realization sat in my stomach like cold grease. I looked through the windshield of the Mercedes, my eyes fixed on the ambulance where Tasha was being draped in a shock blanket. She was leaning her head against the frame of the door, her eyes squeezed shut, the very image of a traumatized daughter. 10 feet away, Jordan was holding his phone to his ear, his face contorted in what looked like a frantic conversation with the police. But his eyes were scanning the perimeter, restless and sharp. They weren't mourning the building. They were waiting for the signal that the transfer was complete. "Camille?" David's voice broke through the static in my head. He was looking at me, his hand hovering near my shoulder, sensing the sudden icy shift in my temperature. "What did the message say?" I didn't hand him the phone. I didn't have to. I simply turned the screen toward him. David read it, his brow furrowing into deep, weathered lines. He looked at the ambulance, then back at the burning remains of the St. Clair headquarters. As a federal prosecutor, he had seen every shade of human greed. But the sight of a mother being picked apart by her own fledglings always left a bitter taste. "If the money is in their accounts," David whispered, "then the arson wasn't just about erasing Elias's fraud. It was about erasing the paper trail that connects the children to the shell companies. They're making him the fall guy. They're letting him run, letting him take the blame for the fire and the theft, while they sit here in Savannah as the grieving heirs to a bankrupt estate they've secretly already hollowed out." "They used me to get the drive," I said. My voice was so low it was almost a hum. "Tasha knew I wouldn't let her burn. She knew I'd go into that basement. She knew I'd save the evidence for her." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the hard drive. It was small, heavy, and cold. To Tasha, this was the key to a life of unearned luxury in a country with no extradition treaty. To me, it was the digital umbilical cord that still tied me to the monsters I had birthed. "Drive," I said. "Where?" "Away from here. We need a secure line and a computer that hasn't been touched by the St. Clair network." David didn't ask questions. He put the Mercedes in gear and navigated the maze of emergency vehicles. As we pulled away, I saw Jordan look up. Our eyes met through the glass for a split second. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stared, a predatory stillness settling over his features. He knew. He knew the moment I left that site without speaking to them, the game had changed. We drove to a small, nondescript office building in the Starland district, a place David kept for sensitive witness prep. It was a sterile room with white walls, a single desk, and a high-speed fiber connection. David plugged the drive into a clean laptop. My heart was a drum in my ears, a rhythmic thudding that felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. "It's encrypted," David said, his fingers flying across the keys. "But it's a standard St. Clair protocols, Tasha's favorite cipher." He paused, looking at me. "She uses your birthday, Camille, combined with the date of the anniversary." The irony was a physical sting. Using the day I gave her life and the day they tried to take it away as the lock for their stolen fortune.
"Try it," I said. The screen flickered, then turned a deep, bruising blue. Rows of spreadsheets, bank routing numbers, and PDF documents began to populate the screen. David opened the primary folder labeled Legacy 2.0. There it was. The $600,000 from my retirement was just the deposit. There were transfers totaling $4 million from the Thorne Vaughn Trust, money that should have required my signature. "Look at the authorization," I pointed at the screen. David zoomed in. The signature at the bottom of the digital wire transfer was mine. The elegant looped C and the sharp, decisive V. But as I stared at it, I saw the flaw. It was too perfect. It was the signature of a woman who wasn't hurried, a woman who wasn't under stress. "It's a scan," I said. "From the anniversary invitations. Tasha handled the printing. She had a high-resolution file of my signature for the embossed cards." "And look at the destination," David said, his voice hardening. The money wasn't going to Silas Vance. It was going to an entity called the Little Sparrows Trust. My mind flashed back to the ballroom, my grandchildren, Leo and Ava. "Grandma Saffron, look! I found the blue ones!" They had set the trust up in the names of the children. It was a brilliant, wicked move. If the authorities ever came looking for the money, they would find it sitting in the accounts of two innocent children managed by their guardian, Saffron LeClaire, who was, in turn, being managed by Tasha and Jordan. They had used my grandchildren as human shields for their greed. They knew I would never prosecute or claw back money if it meant my grandchildren would lose their future. They had banked on my mother's heart being the one thing they could always manipulate. "They think I'm soft," I whispered, staring at the names of my grandchildren on the screen. "They think because I've spent 30 years being the pillow for their falls, I don't have any stones in me." I leaned back in the chair. The room felt very cold. I thought about the Sunday dinners. I thought about the way I'd folded their laundry, the way I'd listened to their complaints about their stifling father, all while they were quietly measuring the height of my gallows. "David," I said, my voice gaining a new, terrifying clarity, "who is the secondary trustee on a minor's trust in the state of Georgia if the primary guardian is found to be unfit?" David, the prosecutor, caught my drift instantly. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. "The state would appoint a successor trustee, usually the closest living relative with a clean financial record, someone like the grandmother. And if the funds were moved into that trust under fraudulent circumstances," I continued, "but the successor trustee, me, refused to move them back, choosing instead to lock them into a restricted educational endowment that none of the parents could touch until the children were 35? "You'd be stripping Tasha and Jordan of the cash," David said. "They'd have the satisfaction of knowing the money exists, but they wouldn't be able to buy a single cup of coffee with it. It would stay in the children's names, but the adults would be effectively disinherited. They'd be broke, Camille. Legally, they'd be tied to a fortune they can't use." "And Saffron?" "If we can prove she was a knowing participant in the fraud and the arson, she goes to prison. She loses the children, she loses the money, and she loses the grandma title she tried to steal." I looked at the silver sparrow pin on the desk. "Elias told me sparrows find their way home because they look at the ground," I said. "My children looked at the sky. They looked at the private jets and the penthouses and the legacy. They forgot that the ground they're standing on belongs to me." I stood up. I felt a strange, humming power in my limbs. The exhaustion was gone, burned away by the realization that I was no longer protecting a family. I was managing a hostile takeover. "What's the first step?" I asked. "We need Saffron," David said,
She's the weak link. Tasha and Jordan are lawyers and executives. They know how to hold a line under pressure. But Saffron is 24, pregnant, and currently sitting in a hospital waiting room wondering if her golden ticket just exploded in a Bentley. She's not at the hospital, I said, remembering the black sedan I'd seen at the fire. Elias is gone. He wouldn't leave her there to be questioned by the police. He stashed her somewhere. Somewhere he thinks I won't look. The beach house? No. He knows I have the deed to that. He's smarter than that. I closed my eyes, picturing the map of our lives. Elias was a man of habit. He liked to keep his secrets in places that felt earned. The hunting lodge, I said. The one in South Carolina. It's registered under his mother's maiden name, Kavanaugh. He thinks I forgot about that property because we haven't been there in 20 years. Can you get us there? I can do better than that, I said, picking up my phone. I can make her come to me. I dialed Saffron's number. I had found it on the bill 3 months ago, tucked under a consultation fee. She picked up on the third ring. Her voice was thin, reedy, and vibrating with panic. Hello? Elias? No, Saffron. It's Camille. Silence. A long, heavy silence, where I could practically hear the gears of her survival instinct grinding. Mrs. St. Clair, she whispered. I'm so sorry about the accident. I didn't know you were going to be at the car. Stop, I said. My voice was like a silk ribbon wrapped around a razor blade. We don't have time for the script Elias gave you. I'm currently sitting with a federal prosecutor and a hard drive that has your name attached to $4 million of stolen Vaughn trust money. Do you know what the mandatory minimum is for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit arson when it involves a federal building? Arson? She gasped. I didn't know about any fire. Elias said he was just clearing some old files. He lied to you, Saffron. Just like he lied to me for 35 years. He's gone. He's on a plane, or he will be soon. And he's left you behind to be the face of the Little Sparrows Trust. When the FBI walks into that hunting lodge, they aren't going to ask for Elias. They're going to handcuff the woman whose name is on the LLC. He wouldn't leave me, she sobbed. I'm carrying his son. He tried to burn his own daughter alive this morning, Saffron. Do you really think a son he hasn't met yet is going to stop him from saving his own skin? The sobbing on the other end became hysterical. She was breaking. The grandma who had sat at my table was dissolving into a terrified girl who had realized she was the sacrificial lamb. What do I do? She asked. Please, Mrs. St. Clair, I just wanted a life for my baby. He said you were mean. He said you were cold and that you didn't love the family anymore. I'm cold enough to ensure you never see the outside of a cell, Saffron. Or I'm warm enough to give you a way out. But you have to move fast. Tasha and Jordan are on their way to you. They aren't coming to comfort you. They're coming to make sure you don't talk. They're coming here? They're 10 minutes out, I lied. I had no idea where they were, but I knew Tasha's mind. She would want Saffron silenced before the police could get a formal statement. If you want to live, you'll walk out of that lodge right now, get into the car Elias left you, and drive to the First Savannah Bank. I'll be waiting in the lobby. If you're there before them, I'll consider you a witness. If not, you're a defendant. I hung up. You think she'll come? David asked. She's 24 and pregnant, David. She spent her life looking for a protector. Elias failed her. She'll look for the next strongest person in the room. And right now, that's me. We headed back to the bank. The sun was high now, the Savannah heat thick and suffocating. As we pulled up to the granite fortress, I saw the news vans were already circling. The St. Clair arson was the biggest story in the state. We waited in the private lobby. Julian Sterling sat with us, his face pale, a stack of legal documents in front of him. "Camille," Julian said, his voice trembling, "I've initiated the clawback. But the children... Tasha has already filed a counter-injunction claiming your mental state is unstable. She's using the video from the anniversary, the one where you gave up your seat, as evidence of a manic episode." I looked at the television in the corner. There I was, in champagne silk, pulling out a chair for a pregnant mistress, smiling like a martyr. Out of context, it did look strange. It looked like a woman who had finally snapped. "She's good," I admitted. "She's using my own grace against me." But then the heavy brass doors of the bank swung open. Saffron Leclerc walked in. She was disheveled, her sage-green dress wrinkled, her eyes red-rimmed and wild. She looked like a woman who had been running through a forest. She saw me and practically collapsed toward the desk. "I'm here," she panted. "I'm here. Please, don't let them take me." "Sit down, Saffron," I said, not moving from my chair. As she sat, I saw a black SUV pull up to the curb outside. Tasha and Jordan stepped out. They weren't looking at the cameras. They were looking at the bank. They saw the Mercedes. They saw the movement inside. They walked through the doors with the confidence of people who still believed they owned the building. Tasha walked straight to me, her eyes burning with a cold, corporate fury. "Mom, this is enough. You've kidnapped Saffron, you've interfered with a police investigation, and you're currently in violation of a temporary restraining order I just had a judge sign." She held up a piece of paper. I didn't look at the paper. I looked at Saffron. "Saffron," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "Tell Tasha what you told me on the phone about the fire." Saffron looked at Tasha. The fear in the girl's eyes was palpable. She looked at the little sparrow necklace around her own neck, then back at me. "She said Elias tried to kill her," Saffron whispered, her voice gaining strength. "She said he sent Miller to lock the door, and she said the money in the trust isn't for the baby. It's for you, Tasha. You and Jordan." The silence that followed was absolute. Jordan's face drained of color. Tasha didn't flinch, but I saw the slight tremor in her jaw, the telltale sign that she was recalculating. "She's lying," Tasha said, her voice flat. "She's a mistress who's trying to save her own skin. Mom, you're listening to a woman who slept with your husband for 2 years. Do you really trust her over your own daughter?" I stood up. I walked over to Tasha, stopping so close I could smell the smoke still clinging to her hair. "I don't trust either of you," I said. "That's the beauty of it. I don't have to trust you to destroy you. You see, Tasha, you forgot one very important thing about your father's lease agreement with the Vaughn Trust." Tasha frowned. "What are you talking about? The lease for the land? The land Silas Vance wants so badly? It has a morality and conduct clause. My father was an old-fashioned man. He stipulated that if any member of the Street Clare family, including the heirs, were found to be involved in criminal activity involving the estate, the lease is terminated, and all assets on the land, including the building you just burned, revert to the Vaughn Trust. Personally." I leaned in closer. That means the insurance payout for that building? It doesn't go to St. Clair Development. It doesn't go to you or Jordan. It comes to me. The fire you set to cover your tracks? You just handed me $40 million in insurance proceeds and stripped yourselves of every legal right to the land. Jordan let out a strangled sound. Tasha's eyes went wide. She looked at Julian, who slowly nodded. "The clause is valid, Tasha," Julian said. "I've already flagged the insurance carrier. They're currently listing you and Jordan as persons of interest in an arson-for-profit investigation." "You can't do this," Tasha hissed. "We're your family. We're the only ones you have." "No," I said, looking at the door where my sister Sarah was walking in, followed by a team of men in dark suits. "I have Sarah. I have David. And most importantly, I have my peace." I turned to Saffron. "You're going to go with these men, Saffron. You're going to tell them everything about Elias's meetings with Miller. You're going to tell them about the Legacy 2.0 folder. If you do, I'll make sure the trust for your baby stays in place. But you will never, ever call yourself grandma in my presence again. Do you understand?" Saffron nodded vigorously, tears streaming down her face. I looked back at my children. They stood in the center of the bank lobby, the ruins of their lives visible in the way their expensive clothes suddenly looked like rags. "Mom, please," Jordan said, taking a step toward me. "We can talk about this. We were just trying to survive. Dad was going to leave us with nothing." "You already have nothing, Jordan," I said. "Except the lawyers you're going to need. I suggest you use what's left in your personal accounts to retain them. Because as of 5 minutes ago, I've frozen your access to the firm." I walked toward the elevator. "Where are you going?" Tasha screamed after me, her voice echoing in the marble hall. "You can't just walk away from us!" I stopped and looked back at her. I thought about the 35 years I had spent holding the rope. I thought about the blisters on my hands and the ache in my soul. "I'm not walking away, Tasha," I said, my voice perfectly calm, perfectly regal. "I'm just taking my seat. It's a bit lonely at the head of the table, but the view is much better when you're not carrying the weight of ghosts." I stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, the last thing I saw was my daughter, the lioness I had raised, falling to her knees on the cold, hard floor of the bank I now owned. I didn't feel a sting. I didn't feel a tear. I simply felt the grace of a burden being placed down. But as the elevator ascended to the executive suite, the screen on the wall flickered. It was a news update. Private jet crashed in the Georgia marshes. No survivors. Pilot and 1 passenger identified. I closed my eyes. Elias was gone. The man who started the fire had been consumed by the wind. But then, the elevator stopped. The doors opened. Sitting in my father's old leather chair, looking out over the city of Savannah, was a man I hadn't seen in 30 years. He was holding a silver sparrow pin. "Hello, Camille," Silas Vance said. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." The man sitting in my father's chair didn't look like a monster. Silas Vance looked like a grandfather who had spent too much time in the sun. His skin the color of well-oiled mahogany, his hair a shock of white wool, and his eyes the pale, piercing blue-gray of the Atlantic before a storm. He wore a linen suit that probably cost more than Jordan's first car, and he sat with the absolute, terrifying stillness of a man who didn't need to move to be felt. "Hello, Camille," he repeated, his voice a smooth, low-country drawl that sounded like honey poured over gravel. "I'd offer you a seat, but I believe this one is technically yours now, along with the rest of this expensive view." I didn't step further into the room. I stood in the doorway of the executive suite, the elevator doors having hissed shut behind me. I was still a wreck. My gown was ruined, my skin was tight with dried soot, and my heart was heavy with the news of Elias's death. But I did not tremble. I stood tall, my chin parallel to the floor, my eyes locked onto the man who had been the architect of my family's destruction for 30 years. "Silas," I said. The name felt like ash in my mouth. "You're trespassing. This floor is restricted to Vaughn Trust principles." "Is it?" He held up the silver sparrow pin between his thumb and forefinger. It wasn't the one I had. It was a replica, perhaps, or a second key. "I think you'll find that the restricted nature of this office became a bit more fluid the moment your husband's plane kissed the marsh. You see, Camille, Elias was a gambler. And when a gambler runs out of his own money, he starts betting things that don't belong to him." "Elias is dead," I said, my voice flat. "He is," Silas agreed, a faint, mocking smile touching his lips. "A tragedy. A private jet, a sudden engine failure over the Altamaha Sound. Very cinematic. He always did have a flair for the dramatic. But death doesn't settle a debt, Camille. In Savannah, death just moves the debt to the person left standing in the prettiest dress." I walked into the room then, moving with a slow, predatory grace toward the desk. I didn't go around it to confront him. I stopped at the sideboard, poured myself a glass of water from the crystal carafe, and took a deliberate sip. My father used to say that if you want to win a fight with a lion, you have to act like the lion is beneath your notice. "Elias owed you nothing," I said, turning back to him. "The contracts he signed with your firm were fraudulent. They were built on land he didn't own. My lawyer is downstairs with the original deeds. The moment the FBI finishes with the arson investigation at the headquarters, they'll be coming for you, Silas. You're a co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar fraud against my trust." Silas chuckled. It was a dry, hollow sound. "Oh, Camille, you always were the smartest person in the room, and the most willfully blind. You think I was conspiring with Elias?" He leaned forward, placing the silver sparrow on the desk's blotter. "I was his landlord," Silas said. 36 years ago, before you walked down that aisle in your white lace and your family's pride, Elias Thorne came to me. He was a boy with a silver tongue and a pocket full of nothing. He knew your father would never let a nobody marry into the Vaughn line. So, I gave him the buy-in. I gave him the seed money to look like a success. I gave him the Bentley he used to court you. I even gave him that sparrow pin." I felt the water in my glass go still. "I didn't just bankroll his life, Camille. I bankrolled his marriage," Silas continued. "The deal was simple. He gets the Vaughn name, the Vaughn connections, and the Vaughn access. In return, I get 40% of everything he builds. For 30 years, Elias paid his tithe, but then he got greedy. He thought he could cut me out by selling the marshlands, your marshlands, to an offshore group and disappearing with the profit." "The Legacy Foundation," I whispered. "Exactly. He wasn't selling to me, Camille. He was stealing from me to escape me. He used your children to set up the accounts because he knew I'd hesitate to go after my own godchildren." I nearly dropped the glass. Godchildren? You aren't their godfather, Silas. Reverend Miller is. Silas's eyes crinkled at the corners. On paper, yes. In reality, I paid for Tasha's law school. I paid for Jordan's first 3 failed business ventures. I've been the invisible hand in their lives since they were in diapers. Why do you think they turned on you so easily last night? It wasn't because of their father's mistress. It was because I told them the bank was calling in the markers. I told them that if they didn't help me liquidate Elias, they'd be standing on the street with nothing but their pride. And we both know the St. Clair children have very little of that. The room seemed to tilt. The betrayal I had felt downstairs from Tasha and Jordan was a scratch compared to this. It wasn't just a recent pivot. My children had been cultivated by Silas Vance for their entire lives. They were his sleepers, his insurance policy. I set the glass down on the mahogany surface with a sharp clack. "So why tell me this now?" I asked. "If you have them in your pocket, if Elias is dead, why are you sitting in my chair?" "Because," Silas said, standing up. He was taller than I remembered, a towering figure of old-world menace. "Elias was a coward. He died before he could sign the final transfer of the marshland deeds. And since your father's trust is so beautifully, annoyingly ironclad, the land doesn't go to his estate. It stays with the estate of Camille Vaughn." He walked around the desk, stopping just inches from me. I could smell the expensive tobacco and the faint scent of salt air on him. "The envelope you got last night? The one addressed to your estate? That wasn't a threat of death, Camille. It was an invitation. I was telling you that as far as the world is concerned, Camille St. Clair is finished. But Camille Vaughn, she's the one who holds the pen. I want the land, Camille. All of it. The 3,000 acres of tidal marsh between here and the Sound. That land is a sanctuary," I said, my voice trembling with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. "It's been in my family since 1890. My grandfather survived a lynching on that land. My father is buried near the creek. You want to turn it into a deep-water port. You want to poison the water for a paycheck." "I want to build the future," Silas countered. "And I'm going to, one way or another. Now you have 2 choices. You can sign the transfer today. In exchange, I make the arson investigation disappear. I make sure Tasha keeps her bar license. I make sure Jordan doesn't go to federal prison for the wire fraud I helped him commit. Your family stays perfect. You keep the mansion, the name, and enough money to live out your days in silk-lined peace." "And the second choice?" Silas leaned in, his voice a chilling whisper. "The second choice is that you fight me. And if you fight me, I will strip you of everything. I will release the records of your father's creative accounting from the 60s. I will let the police find the evidence that you were the one who tampered with the Bentley. After all, you're the one who told the valet where the keys were. You're the one with the motive. I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life in a cold cell, watching from a tiny window as I pave over your father's grave." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a fountain pen. My father's fountain pen. The one with the gold nib that had been missing from his desk since the funeral. He laid it on the desk next to a single sheet of paper. "Sign it, Camille. For the children." I looked at the pen. I looked at the paper. I looked at the man who thought he had spent 30 years buying my life. And then I did something Silas Vance didn't expect. I laughed. It wasn't a hysterical laugh. It was a soft, melodic sound. The sound of a woman who had just realized she was playing a game with a man who didn't realize the board had been flipped. "You think you bought my children, Silas?" I asked, stepping back and smoothing the ruined silk of my gown. You think you bankrolled Elias? You think you're the invisible hand? I walked over to the large floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city I loved. The Spanish moss was swaying in the breeze, the shadows of the oaks lengthening on the squares below. Silas, you spent 30 years giving money to a man who was a professional liar, I said, not turning around. Did you never wonder why Elias always seemed to have just enough to pay your tithe, but never enough to buy himself out of your debt? Silas frowned. He was a spendthrift. He liked the lifestyle. No, I said, turning back to him. He was a conduit. Every dollar you gave him, every loan you provided for the kids, every seed money payment, Elias didn't spend it. He gave it to me. Silas went still. What? Elias was a coward. You're right about that, I said, walking toward him. He was terrified of you. He knew from day one that he was a puppet. So, he did the only thing a puppet can do to survive. He started siphoning. He told you the projects were over budget. He told you the subcontractors were demanding more. And then he brought that money home to me, crying, telling me he was investing in our future. I stood in front of him, my height nearly matching his and my heels. I knew the money was dirty, Silas. I'm a Vaughn. We know the scent of blood on a dollar. I didn't spend it. I didn't put it in the bank. I put it into a separate offshore trust that you can't touch. A trust that has been growing, compounding, and waiting for 35 years. While you were busy cultivating my children, I was busy buying up your debt. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a small blue folder David had given me in the car. You wanted to talk about markers, Silas? Let's talk about them. Your firm, Vance Maritime, took a massive hit during the 2008 crash. You stayed afloat by taking out private equity loans from a group in the Cayman Islands called the Sparrow's Nest. You've been paying interest to that group for 15 years. I tapped the folder. I am the Sparrow's Nest, Silas. I am your primary creditor. You don't own the St. Clair children. I own your company's headquarters. I own your fleet. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, when I authorized the clawback from the bank downstairs, I've triggered a default clause in your lending agreement. Silas's face didn't just pale. It turned a sickly grayish hue. He looked at the folder, then at the pen on the desk. You wouldn't, he stammered. You'd destroy yourself. The scandal. I'm 62 years old, Silas, I said, my voice rising with a quiet, devastating power. I've spent 35 years being the scandal-free wife of a ghost. I've lived in a cage of respectability that you helped build. You think I'm afraid of a little mud? I'm covered in it. I'm covered in the ash of my husband's empire and the soot of my daughter's betrayal. I have nothing left to lose but my land. I picked up my father's fountain pen. I felt the weight of it, the history of it. You want me to sign this paper for the children? I asked. I took the paper, crumpled it into a ball, and dropped it into the crystal water glass. The ink began to bleed, turning the water a dark, murky blue. My children can find their own way, I said. If they want to be your godchildren, they can go to you for their bail money. But they will not do it on my father's land, and you will not set foot on this floor again. I walked to the door and pressed the intercom. Security, please escort Mr.
Vance from the building. He's no longer a guest of the trust. Silas stared at me. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Not the fear of a businessman losing a deal, but the fear of a man who realized he had been underestimating a storm for 3 decades. "This isn't over, Camille," he hissed as 2 large men in suits appeared in the doorway. "You think David Holloway can protect you? You think a few offshore accounts make you a queen? I'll burn this city to the ground before I let a woman like you take what I've spent my life building." "You've already burned enough, Silas," I said. "Now, it's time to see what grows in the clearing." As they led him out, Silas turned back one last time. "You really think he's dead? You really think Elias would just fly into a marsh?" The elevator doors closed on his words. I stood in the center of the office, the silence rushing back in like a tide. I looked at the blue-tinted water in the glass. "You really think he's dead?" The question echoed in my mind. Silas was a predator. He knew how to plant a seed of doubt. But I had seen the news. I had seen the tail number of the jet. I walked back to the desk and sat in my father's chair. It felt different now. It didn't feel like a throne. It felt like a cockpit. I picked up the phone and dialed David. "David, where are you?" "I'm at the hospital, Camille. Tasha is being released into police custody for questioning. Jordan he's disappeared. He slipped out the back while the detectives were talking to the doctor." "Find him, David. And listen, I need you to do something for me. Something unofficial." "Anything." "I need you to get a copy of the manifest for that jet. Not the one filed with the FAA, the real one. I want to know who else was on that plane." "Why?" "Because Silas Vance just tried to tell me that Elias St. Clair isn't a ghost. He's a survivor." I hung up. I looked out the window. The sun was setting now, casting long, bloody streaks across the horizon. And then I saw it. On the corner of the desk, where Silas had been sitting, was a small white envelope I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't vellum. It wasn't professional. It was a simple handwritten note on hotel stationery. I opened it. "Camille, the sparrow has 2 wings, one for the land and one for the sea. You found the land, but Saffron has the sea. Ask her about the blue almonds again. It wasn't a candy, Camille. It was a coordinate." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The blue almonds. I remembered Leo's voice in the ballroom. "Grandma Saffron, look! I found the blue ones!" He hadn't been talking about the candy on the table. He had been looking at the map in Saffron's purse. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. I didn't wait for the elevator. I took the stairs, my heels clicking like a heart rate monitor on the concrete. I reached the lobby just as the evening news was beginning to broadcast on the monitors. "Update on the St. Clair jet crash," the reporter said. "Authorities have recovered the black box. However, a startling discovery has been made at the crash site. Only one body was recovered from the wreckage, the body of the pilot." I stopped in the middle of the lobby. "The second passenger, Elias St. Clair, is nowhere to be found. And search crews have discovered something else nearby. A high-speed life raft, deployed and empty, heading toward the international waters of the Atlantic." I looked at the silver sparrow in my hand. I hadn't just been cleaning up a mess. I had been playing the distraction. Elias wasn't dead. He was moving the real assets. And Saffron wasn't his victim. She was his navigator. I walked out of the bank and into the warm Savannah night. The grace was gone. The peace was a lie.
The war hadn't ended with the fire. It had just moved to the water. The lobby of the First Savannah Bank felt like a tomb. Not the kind that holds the dead, but the kind that preserves the secrets of the living. I stood under the glow of the television monitors, the reporter's voice fading into a dull roar in my ears. Only one body recovered, the pilot. The grace I had fought so hard to maintain felt like it was fraying at the edges, not from grief, but from the sheer, insulting audacity of the man I had shared a bed with for 3 decades. Elias hadn't just tried to kill me. He hadn't just tried to replace me. He had turned my entire reality into a stage play, and I was the only one who hadn't realized the curtains were supposed to close on my own funeral. I looked at the silver sparrow in my hand. I thought about Saffron, the girl who had sat in the bank lobby an hour ago, weeping and shaking, playing the part of the discarded mistress. I had felt a flicker of something close to pity for her. I had seen her as another victim of Elias's hunger. How easily we believe the lies that confirm our own moral superiority. I walked toward the security office of the bank. Arthur, the guard, looked up from his monitors, his face etched with concern. "Mrs. St. Clair, Ms. Vaughn, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I haven't seen him yet, Arthur," I said, my voice steady, though my blood felt like it was made of dry ice. "Where is the woman? The one who was with the legal team?" "They took her to the private conference room in the basement, ma'am. Judge Sarah's orders. They're waiting for the federal transport." "Open the door, Arthur." "Ma'am, I'm not supposed to let anyone in without the judge's—" "Arthur," I said, leaning over the desk. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I used the tone my mother used when she found a secret in the cellar. A tone that suggested the world was about to change and you wanted to be on the right side of the shift. "I am the owner of this building. I am the trustee of the accounts that pay your pension. And I am the woman whose life is currently being used as a GPS coordinate. Open the door." The basement conference room was a soundproofed glass box. Inside, Saffron LeClaire was sitting at a long mahogany table. She wasn't crying anymore. She was staring at her reflection in the glass, her fingers tracing the monogrammed SSC necklace I had noticed at the anniversary party. She looked up when I entered. The fear was gone. In its place was a cold, glassy-eyed defiance that made her look 10 years older. "The news just broke, didn't it?" she asked. Her voice was no longer reedy. It was flat, efficient. "One body," I said, closing the door and engaging the privacy tint. The glass went opaque, turning the room into a silent island. "The pilot. Elias is in the water, Saffron. But not the way the search teams think." Saffron leaned back in her chair. She crossed her legs, and for the first time, I realized the maternity dress didn't quite sit right. It wasn't that she wasn't pregnant. It was the way she carried it. It wasn't a burden to her. It was a shield. "He's on the Grace of Savannah," she said. I froze. The Grace of Savannah was a 60-foot classic yacht Elias had supposedly sold 3 years ago to cover a tax liability. I had seen the bill of sale. I had signed the insurance cancellation. "He didn't sell it," I whispered. "He sold it to me," Saffron said, a small, cruel smile touching her lips. "Well, to an LLC in my name. We've been refitting it in a private dry dock in Beaufort for 18 months. It has a reinforced hull, satellite uplinks, and enough fuel to get to the Caymans without docking once." I walked toward her, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet. "And the blue almonds?" Leo wasn't looking at candy, was he? Saffron laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound.
Your grandson is a very observant boy, Camille. Elias spent hours with him, showing him the nautical charts on the iPad. He called the Deepwater Shoals blue almonds because of their shape on the bathymetric map. It was a game, a way to teach the boy how to find his grandpa if they ever got separated. The depravity of it made me want to strike her. To use a 6-year-old's innocence to map an escape route for a fraudster. You aren't just his mistress, I realized. You're his quartermaster. I'm the woman who did what you were too proud to do, Camille, she hissed, standing up. The defiance finally boiled over. You spent 30 years being the Queen of Savannah. You worried about the legacy and the reputation and the family name. You were so busy being a Vaughn that you forgot to be a partner. Elias was drowning in your family's history. I gave him a future. I gave him a way to keep what he built. He built it with my money, I said, my voice rising. He built it with his sweat. You just provided the dirt, Saffron shouted. But it doesn't matter now. By the time you find those coordinates, he'll be in international waters, and I'll be joining him as soon as my lawyers get me out of here. You think you're leaving? I asked. I'm a pregnant woman who was coerced by a powerful man, she said, her voice shifting back into that practiced, victimized tone. I've already told the police I was afraid for my life. I've already told them Elias forced me to sign those documents. With the jet crash and his disappearance, I'm the tragic survivor. They won't touch me, especially not with a Vaughn grandchild in my belly. I looked at her stomach. I looked at the SSC on her neck. Is it even his, Saffron? She blinked. Just for a second, the mask slipped. Of course it is, she snapped. I looked at the bank records again while I was upstairs, I said, bluffing with a confidence that felt like fire in my veins. The fertility clinic in Atlanta? The one you visited 4 times last year? Elias had a vasectomy 20 years ago, Saffron, after Jordan was born. He never told you, did he? He liked the idea of a legacy too much to admit he'd closed the factory. Saffron's face didn't just pale. It went the color of bone. She stumbled back against the table. He wouldn't, she whispered. He told me we were starting over. He said this baby was the new St. Clair. He lied to you to keep you loyal, I said, stepping closer until I could see the sweat beads on her upper lip. He needed a navigator. He needed someone young enough to move the money and pretty enough to distract the board. You aren't his new start, Saffron. You're his decoy. Just like the pilot on that jet was his decoy. I reached out and grabbed the little sparrow necklace. I didn't snap it. I just held the pendant in my fist. He's not waiting for you at the Blue Almonds, I said. He's heading for the coast of West Africa. I found the flight plan for the secondary jet, the one he's meeting the yacht with. There's only one seat on that plane, Saffron, and it's not for a woman with a child that isn't his. I let go of the necklace. Saffron sank into the chair, the reality of Elias's ultimate betrayal finally sinking its teeth into her. She had sold her soul for a man who didn't even have a soul to trade. He's leaving me, she breathed. After everything. He's leaving me with the feds. Unless, I said. She looked up, her eyes wide and wet. Unless what? Unless you give me the real coordinates. Not the ones he told the boy. The real ones. The ones in the locked safe on the yacht's bridge. I don't have the code, she sobbed. He said he'd give it to me when I boarded. But you have the phone, I said, pointing to the encrypted device sitting on the table.
The one he uses to track the yacht's transponder. He thinks I'm too old to understand the tech. He thinks I'm still using a rotary phone and a prayer book. I picked up the device. Unlock it, Saffron. Show me where he is. Show me the man who tried to burn our daughter. Saffron hesitated. For a moment, I saw the ghost of her loyalty, the desperate hope that I was lying about the vasectomy, the hope that Elias was still her prince. But then the intercom on the wall buzzed. Ms. Vaughn, this is Arthur. Your son is here. Jordan. He's in the lobby, and he's demanding to see the girl. He says he has a message from his father. I looked at Saffron. She looked at the door. Jordan didn't disappear, I whispered. He was the one who picked Elias up from the marsh. He's the one who's making sure the loose ends are tied. Saffron's hands flew to her phone. She swiped, her fingers trembling so hard she almost dropped it. She tapped a series of icons and shoved the screen toward me. There, she gasped. He's at the 32nd parallel, heading east-southeast. He's reaching the deep water shelf in 40 minutes. If he hits that, the Coast Guard can't intercept without an international warrant. I looked at the blue dot on the map. It was moving fast. And Saffron? Yes? Stay in this room. Don't let Jordan in. If he gets to you, he'll do what his father couldn't finish. I turned and ran for the elevator. I didn't call David. I didn't call the police. I knew how the system worked in Savannah. It was too slow, too tangled in the very webs Elias had spent 30 years weaving. I called the only person I knew who owned a boat faster than a St. Clair yacht and who owed my father a debt that could never be repaid. Captain Miller, I said when the voice answered. Not the Miller who worked for Vance. The other Miller. The one who lived on the docks and ran the high-speed pilot boats for the Savannah River. Camille, I heard about the crash. I'm sorry for your loss. Don't be sorry, Ben. Be ready. I'm at the bank. I need to be on the water in 10 minutes. And Ben? Yeah? Bring the heavy engines. We're going to the 32nd parallel. I burst out of the bank lobby. Jordan was there, standing by the fountain, looking frantic. When he saw me, his face transformed into a mask of faux relief. Mom, thank God. I heard about the body. The pilot. I've been looking everywhere for you. I didn't stop. I walked right past him toward the Mercedes. Mom, wait! He shouted, grabbing my arm. Where are you going? We need to go to the hospital. The police are asking questions about the Bentley again. I stopped. I turned and looked at my son. The man I had carried. The man I had protected. The man who was currently trying to hold me back so his father could escape with my life's work. I didn't slap him. I didn't scream. I leaned in and whispered into his ear. I know about the 32nd parallel, Jordan. And I know you were at the marsh. Jordan's grip on my arm went slack. His eyes widened, the pupils dilating until they were black pits of terror. Mom, you don't understand. He said he'd take care of us. He was going to leave you to burn in the HQ with your sister, Jordan, I said. He was going to let you be the one who signed the Vance contracts. You're not his partner. You're his expendable asset. I pulled my arm away. Go home, Jordan. Sit in the house I bought you. Drink the wine I paid for. And wait for the knock on the door. Because when I come back from that water, there won't be enough legacy left to save you. I got into the Mercedes and roared away, leaving my son standing in the shadow of the bank, a broken boy who had realized too late that the foundation he'd tried to crack was actually the only thing keeping him upright. I reached the docks in 7 minutes. Captain Ben Miller was waiting, his 50-foot catamaran humming with a low, predatory growl. You sure about this, Camille? he asked as I stepped onto the deck, my champagne silk dress now completely ruined, stained with oil and salt air. It's getting rough out there. A storm is rolling in from the south. The storm has been here for 35 years, Ben, I said, looking out at the dark horizon. I'm just finally sailing into it. As we cleared the harbor and the engines roared to life, the shore of Savannah began to fade into a blur of twinkling lights. I stood at the bow, the wind whipping my hair, the salt spray stinging my eyes. I looked at the tracking device Saffron had given me. The blue dot was slowing down. He wasn't running anymore. He was waiting. And then I saw it on the radar. Another vessel was approaching the Grace of Savannah, a much larger one. Silas Vance's container ship. Elias wasn't running from Silas. He was meeting him. The arson, the fraud, the crash. It wasn't a fight between two men. It was a merger. And I was the only thing standing between them and the complete erasure of the Vaughn name. I looked at Ben. Faster. Camille, we're at red line. I don't care. Push it. We hit the 30-second parallel just as the moon broke through the clouds. There, sitting like a ghost on the black water, was the yacht. And next to it, the towering wall of a Vance cargo ship. I saw a figure on the deck of the yacht, a man in a white linen shirt holding a briefcase. He was looking up at the ladder being lowered from the cargo ship. Elias. He looked happy. He looked free. He didn't see us until we were 50 yards away. I grabbed the spotlight and slammed it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, pinning him against the white hull of the yacht like a moth to a card. Elias shielded his eyes, stumbling back. I picked up the megaphone. Elias! My voice boomed across the water, amplified and echoing like the judgment of God. The seat is taken! He froze. He looked toward the catamaran, toward the woman in the ruined silk gown standing at the bow. I saw the moment he recognized me. I saw the moment his future turned back into a ghost. But then, a third light ignited. From the deck of the Vance cargo ship, a man stepped to the railing. Silas Vance. But he wasn't looking at Elias. He was looking at me. And he was holding a remote detonator. Camille! Elias screamed, his voice thin and panicked. Get back! He's not here for the merger! He's here for the insurance! The yacht groaned, and then the world turned into fire. The explosion was a wall of white heat that briefly turned the midnight ocean into a midday desert. The shockwave hit Captain Ben's catamaran like a physical fist, throwing me against the railing. For a second, the world was silent, a vacuum of sound where the only thing I could hear was the frantic thrumming of my own heart against my ribs. Then, the roar returned, a wet, guttural growl as the Grace of Savannah began to tear itself apart. Pieces of mahogany, fiberglass, and white linen rained down into the black water. The scent of salt air was replaced by the stinging chemical stench of burning diesel. Camille, get down! Ben screamed, lunging for me as a jagged piece of the yacht's hull whistled past my head, slicing through the air where I had been standing a second before. I didn't get down. I gripped the railing until the metal bit into my palms. I watched the spot where Elias had been standing. The yacht was folding in on itself, a broken toy being pulled into the depths by the weight of its own secrets. Elias! I shouted, my voice swallowed by the hiss of the flames meeting the sea. Through the smoke, I saw him. He hadn't been killed instantly. He was in the water, his white shirt a pale, thrashing ghost against the darkness. He was clinging to a piece of the bridge, the part that held the safe Saffron had mentioned. Even now, With his life bleeding into the Atlantic, he was holding on to the assets. Above us, the Vance cargo ship loomed like a prehistoric predator. Silas Vance was still at the railing, the detonator in his hand. He wasn't running. He was watching the fire with the detached curiosity of a man watching a candle flicker out. "He's going to let him drown," Ben gasped, struggling to keep the catamaran steady in the churning wake. "Camille, we have to move. If that cargo ship starts its engines, we'll be sucked into the screws." "He has the drive, Ben," I said, my voice eerily calm. "The physical backup of the offshore accounts. It's in that briefcase he's holding." I looked at Silas. He saw me. Even across the water, through the haze of the inferno, our eyes locked. He raised the detonator like a glass of fine bourbon, a silent toast to his victory. In his mind, he had just erased his primary debtor and the only man who could testify to his fraud. He had the land, he had the insurance, and he had the St. Clair children in his pocket. But Silas Vance didn't know about the Sparrow's second wing. "Ben, get us closer," I commanded. "Are you crazy? The fuel tanks could go again." "Get us closer." Ben cursed but throttled the engines. We skimmed the edge of the debris field. I grabbed a life ring, but I didn't throw it. I waited until we were 10 feet from where Elias was gasping for air, his face blackened, his eyes wide with a terror that no amount of charm could hide. "Camille!" he choked out, reaching a hand toward me. "Help me! He betrayed me." "Silas, he rigged the yacht when we were in Beaufort." "I know he did, Elias," I said, looking down at him from the bow. I looked at the briefcase he was clutching. "Give me the case." "What? Save me first, I'm slipping." "The case, Elias, or you can take those accounts to the bottom with you." It was the most cold-blooded thing I had ever said. It felt like shedding a skin I had worn for too long, the skin of the woman who always provided the safety net. I was no longer the net. I was the floor. Elias looked at me, and for the first time in 35 years, he saw me. Not the wife, not the strong black woman who managed his chaos, but the woman he had tried to bury. He saw the Vaughn in me. With a strangled sob, he threw the briefcase toward the catamaran. Ben caught it, sliding it across the deck. I looked at Elias. He was exhausted. The current was pulling at him. "Now help me!" he screamed. I looked up at Silas Vance on the cargo ship. He was signaling to his crew. The massive engines of the ship began to thrum, a deep, bone-shaking vibration that signaled he was preparing to leave the scene. He thought he was leaving a shipwreck and a widow behind. "Ben, throw him the line," I said. Ben threw the rope. Elias grabbed it with the desperation of a drowning man, which he was. We hauled him toward the swim platform at the back of the catamaran. When he finally flopped onto the deck, he looked like a landed fish, gasping, pathetic, and entirely hollow. He lay there, shivering in his ruined linen, looking up at me. "Camille, thank God. We can go now. We have the money. We can disappear together. I have a contact in Morocco." I looked down at him. I didn't feel hate. I didn't even feel anger. I felt a profound, echoing pity. "There is no we, Elias," I said. "And there is no disappearance." I picked up the briefcase and handed it to Ben. "Check the seal." Ben opened it. Inside weren't just bank codes. There were photographs. Dozens of them. Not of Saffron, not of the business. They were photos of Silas Vance. Silas at the warehouse. Silas meeting with city officials, Silas handing over envelopes of cash, and one photo, taken 36 years ago, showing Silas Vance standing next to my father's lawyer, a man who had died in a suspicious car accident shortly after my wedding. Elias hadn't just been siphoning money, he had been building a blackmail file. He had known since the beginning that Silas was the real threat, and he had been keeping this as his final insurance policy. "That's why he tried to kill you tonight," I said, looking at the cargo ship as it began to pull away. "He didn't want the land. He wanted the file." "It's all in there," Elias wheezed. "The whole 30 years. Every bribe. Every body Silas buried in the marsh to clear the way for his ports. Camille, that file is worth $100 million. It's worth the Vaughn name," I corrected. I turned to Ben. "Call the Coast Guard. Give them our coordinates and tell them we have a survivor from the St. Clair crash. And Ben, tell them to notify the FBI that Silas Vance is currently attempting to flee the scene of an attempted murder." "Camille, no!" Elias scrambled to his feet, his hand reaching for the briefcase. "If you call the feds, I go down too. Everything we built, the kid's reputation, the house, the legacy, it all turns to ash." I stepped back, the briefcase held firmly against my side. "The legacy turned to ash the moment you let Silas Vance into our home, Elias," I said. "The house was built on a lie. The reputation was a mask. And as for the kids, they already chose their side. They're standing with Silas." "They don't know what he's capable of." "They're about to find out." I walked to the radio and hit the emergency channel. I didn't wait for the authorities to ask questions. I gave a clear, concise report. I felt a strange sense of liberation with every word. I was stripping away the grace, the silence that had protected them all for so long. As the Coast Guard helicopters began to circle overhead, their searchlights cutting through the smoke, I looked at the cargo ship. Silas Vance was gone into the darkness of the Atlantic, but he was leaving a trail of digital and physical breadcrumbs that David Holloway would follow to the ends of the earth. We were escorted back to the Savannah docks under a heavy security detail. The news cameras were there, a wall of flashing lights and shouting voices. I stepped off the catamaran. I was still in my ruined champagne gown, my hair a wild tangle of salt and soot. I looked like a woman who had walked through hell, and perhaps I had. Jordan and Tasha were there, standing behind the police line. They saw Elias being wheeled off the boat on a stretcher, handcuffed to the railing. They saw me walking toward them, carrying the briefcase. They tried to run to me. Tasha was crying, her face a mask of devastated daughter for the cameras. "Mom! Oh my God, you're alive! What happened to Dad? Is he okay?" I stopped in front of her. I didn't say a word. I simply looked at her. Tasha's tears dried up instantly. She saw the look in my eyes, the cold, unyielding sovereignty of a woman who was no longer a mother they could manipulate. "The accounts are frozen, Tasha," I said, my voice carrying over the din of the reporters. "The Little Sparrows Trust has been moved to an educational escrow. You and Jordan have exactly 48 hours to vacate the properties registered to the Vaughn Trust." "Mom, you can't do that," Jordan shouted, stepping forward. "We're your children. We were trying to save the family." "You were trying to save a ghost," I said. I turned to the lead detective who was waiting for me. "Detective, this briefcase contains evidence of the arson at St. Clair HQ, as well as 30 years of racketeering by Silas Vance and my husband. My daughter and son are listed as secondary trustees on several of the accounts involved. I suggest you take them in for questioning now." "Mom!" Tasha screamed as a female officer stepped toward her. "You're sending us to jail? After everything we did for you?" "You didn't do anything for me, Tasha. I said, walking past her toward the black town car David had waiting. You did it for the chair. But you forgot that the chair only has value if the woman sitting in it allows you to stay. I got into the car. David was in the front seat. He didn't say anything. He just handed me a clean silk scarf and a bottle of water. It's over, Camille, he said softly. No, David, I said, looking out the window at the city of Savannah. It's just beginning. We drove to the Vaughn estate, the big, quiet house that had felt like a prison for 35 years. I walked inside. The lights were on, the air was cool, and the scent of lilies was still heavy in the foyer. I went to the dining room. I looked at the long, polished table where I had served 1,000 meals to people who didn't see me. I looked at the head of the table, the seat Elias had tried to give to Saffron. I walked to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the small breakfast nook, the one where I used to hide from the chaos of the kids and the noise of the parties. I looked at my hands. They were blistered. My nails were broken. My skin was stained. I took off the silver sparrow pin and set it on the table. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He wasn't on the cargo ship, Camille. Silas left him behind. I frowned. Left who? Then, a second message. A video file. I opened it. It was a recording from a security camera at the private airfield. I saw Silas Vance boarding his jet. But he wasn't alone. He was with Jordan. My son hadn't been at the docks. The man I had spoken to, the one I thought was Jordan, had been a decoy in a hoodie. My real son, my firstborn, had boarded that plane with the man who tried to kill his father. Jordan hadn't just betrayed me. He had traded his father's life for a seat at Silas Vance's new table. I looked at the tea in my cup. The steam rose in a slow, elegant spiral. I realized then that the matriarch's grace isn't about saving everyone. It's about knowing when the building is too far gone to salvage. I picked up the phone and dialed the FBI field office. This is Camille Vaughn, I said. I have a flight plan for a private jet leaving for the Caymans, and I'd like to report a kidnapping. Who was kidnapped, Ms. Vaughn? I looked at the photo of Jordan on the mantel, the little boy in the sailor suit, smiling with a toothy grin. My son, I said. He was kidnapped by his own greed 30 years ago. I'm just finally calling in the ransom. I hung up. I walked to the window and watched the sun begin to rise over the Savannah River. The marsh was gold and green, ancient and unbothered. I was alone in the house. The silence was absolute. I took a sip of my tea. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. The next morning, the headlines were a storm. St. Clair Empire collapses. Daughter arrested in arson plot. Elias St. Clair in federal custody. Silas Vance and Jordan St. Clair at large. I didn't read them. I spent the day with a landscaping crew. We moved the lilies from the front garden. We replaced them with something hardier, wild jasmine and thorny roses. I spent the evening in my father's study, going through the real books. I found that I was much wealthier than Elias had ever let me believe. I found that the Vaughn legacy wasn't just land. It was a global network of silent investments my father had curated for me, hidden behind layers of corporate veils that only I could pierce. I wasn't a widow. I wasn't a victim. I was the most powerful woman in the South, and no one even knew my name was on the checks. A week later, a letter arrived. No return address, just a postmark from Switzerland. Inside was a single blue almond, not a candy, a real almond, dyed a brilliant oceanic blue, and a note in a child's handwriting. Grandma Camille, I found the blue ones. Come find us. Leo. I looked at the almond. Saffron hadn't just been a mistress. She had been a mother who knew her child was in danger. She hadn't sent Leo to the blue almonds to find Elias. She had sent him there to hide from Silas Vance. And she had sent him with the only person Silas Vance would never suspect, her sister. I looked at the map on my desk, the 32nd parallel. I realized then that the story wasn't over. The grace hadn't reached its limit. I picked up the phone. Ben, get the engines ready. We're going back out. To where, Camille? I looked at the blue almond in my hand. To where the foundation begins, I said. I walked out of the house, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor. I wasn't wearing champagne silk anymore. I was wearing navy linen, sharp, professional, and ready for war. I looked back at the house one last time.